Begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now against that background, let us begin by looking at Epicurus, 342 to 270 BC, and his most famous disciple in Rome, Lucretius, whose famous poem De Rerum Natura on the nature of things is a poetic expression of Epicurus' philosophy. Lucretius is 1st century BC. Now his goal, as most of the philosophers of this period, Epicurus', was to achieve happiness, as he construed it, for the individual. And he thought that there were two main fears that stood in the way of men achieving happiness. The fear of the gods, or in general, the fears inculcated by religion, and the fear of death. As to the gods, they, according to Epicurus, are one of the main factors inhibiting human happiness. The gods, he says, are presented to us by religious people as fickle creatures. They are supposed to have power to interfere in human life, to inflict favors or punishment at their arbitrary decree. How can anybody have any sense of security if you believe a thing like this? If you believe that you are at the mercy of the arbitrary decrees of these allegedly divine beings. You never know what's coming next. You will necessarily feel anxious and helpless. As to death, the second main fear, he said people fear it because they're told that when you die, your soul goes to an unknown realm. Retribution is visited on you by some unknown standard. You're in effect delivered up to some inconceivable dimension ruled over by arbitrary powers. We have to combat these two fears. How? Well, we need an appropriate philosophic basis to make them unwarranted. And for this basis, Epicurus looks back to past philosophic systems and selects the one that he believes to be most congenial to the ethical conclusions he wants to reach. Now you see his procedure here. He does not originate a system of metaphysics or look at reality independently. Instead, he looks back and selects what he thinks is most convenient for his purposes out of what's already been formulated. And as such, he is a philosopher of the second rank, to be generous. And that is true of the whole post-Aristotelian period. Independent interest in major philosophic issues in metaphysics and epistemology is largely past now. The age of real originality is past. Hereafter, they borrow from their predecessors and tinker, making minor modifications within the framework of systems and approaches already established. Epicurus decided that the best system for his purposes was the atomism of Democritus. You remember the little tiny uncuttables, the atoms, moving through the void strictly by mechanistic laws, functioning like little billiard balls, and everything on this theory is simply a combination of atoms, constantly mixing and unmixing in different combinations. And you recall that the soul also was made of atoms, of soul atoms, which were perfectly physical. You could theoretically have a handful of soul, but they were very round, smooth, fine atoms. Now this metaphysics, as you can see, gets rid of the two fears. The gods are obviously superfluous on this philosophy. Epicurus still accepted the existence of gods, apparently because they appeared to people in dreams and he didn't know how to account for this if there were no gods. But he held that the gods are made only of atoms. They have no power to interfere with human beings. They too are just atomic collections, and he in effect thought of them as a sort of glorified race living off in seclusion somewhere, having no ability or desire to influence or affect human life. For practical purposes, therefore, Epicureanism is an atheistic approach to philosophy, as would have to be the case of any materialism. Though, as I said, he did believe in the gods in the sense just mentioned. As far as death is concerned, well, there is, of course, no immortality on the atomist metaphysics. You are simply a certain combination of soul and body atoms. Your consciousness, your personal identity, your sense of you depends on a complex structure of soul atoms quivering in a complex structure of body atoms. Death is simply the dissolution of these structures. The atoms go floating off in new combinations. You have disintegrated. There is no you anymore. And so there's no immortality, and death, therefore, is nothing to fear. Now, this particular point Epicurus expressed in a famous form, which is not dependent upon his atomism as such. He put it this way. This is not an exact quote, but the essence of his idea. Where death is, you aren't. And where you are, death isn't. Death, therefore, he said, concerns neither the living nor the dead. It doesn't concern the living because they are living. And it doesn't concern the dead because they are not. Hence, the fear of death is empty. When it comes, by that fact, you are gone. Therefore, you will never know anything but life. And it is senseless to fear a state you will never know. So much for the fear of death. Now, I observe in passing that this is a perfectly valid, unanswerable argument, and is amply sufficient to answer today's existentialist who wander around moaning neurotically about death as the catastrophic metaphysical threat hanging over human life, which makes everything meaningless and absurd. They simply have no even attempted answer to Epicurus on this point.
So a Hamas delegation arrived in Cairo on Sunday for hostage deal talks, but Israel has boycotted the negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu broke off hostage deal talks because Hamas did not provide a list of all the living Israeli hostages. So Kyle Anzelin actually wrote this part up on Friday, that Netanyahu told Qatar and Egypt, and they're mediating the talks between Israel and Hamas. He told them that there will be no more, Israel will not participate in the talks anymore until Hamas provides a full list of living Israeli hostages in Gaza. And what was interesting is that Haaretz reported on Sunday that they cited sources in the Israeli security cabinet who criticized Netanyahu for making that demand, pretty much saying that it was not a necessary demand, kind of hinting that it was just made to sabotage the negotiations. One of those sources said, quote, "As with the previous deal, one could assume there would eventually be proper lists of the hostages and of those no longer living. This didn't need to be made into a deal breaker for advancing the negotiations," end quote. So the potential deal that's on the table is for Hamas to release about 40 Israeli hostages in exchange for a 6-week ceasefire and the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Hamas has been seeking a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, but there were signs on Sunday that the Palestinian group may be more flexible on its demands. So a senior Hamas source told Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanese-based outlet, their editorial line is very anti-Israel, and one of their Hamas sources said that they think a deal could be reached soon, despite obstacles being put in the way by Israel. The source said, quote, "Despite these obstacles, the possibility of reaching an agreement is still viable, especially as the occupation is being dealt heavy blows in Khan Yunis and Al Zaytun neighborhood," end quote. And I guess the Hamas officials talking about the fighting on the ground there. So citing Arab media, Haaretz also said that a Hamas source said the group could be flexible on the length of the ceasefire and the number of Palestinian prisoners that will be released. But both Hamas sources said that they are standing firm on 2 conditions, which is Israel allowing displaced Palestinians to return to northern Gaza and the delivery of much more aid into the north, where people are really starving. The Ruby Mar, which is a British-owned cargo ship that was hit by a Houthi missile on February 18th, has officially sank. And this was announced by the U.S. military on Saturday. They put a picture out of the ship going under the water. And so this is the first ship that's lost in this Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, where they've been attacking ships. So a British cargo ship has sank, and in response to the news, the Houthis have vowed that they will sink more British ships. So Hussein El-Ezi, the Houthis' deputy foreign minister, said, quote, "Yemen will continue to sink more British ships, and any repercussions or other damages will be added to Britain's bill, as it is a rogue state that attacks Yemen and partners with America in sponsoring the ongoing crime against civilians in Gaza," end quote. So this is just an example of how much things have just become a mess since the U.S. and the U.K. started bombing the Houthis on January 12th. That's when the Houthis started targeting American and British commercial shipping. And it just continues to escalate, and they're not showing any sign of backing down. And I also mentioned on February 29th and March 1st, which was last Thursday and Friday, the U.S. reported that it launched more missile strikes in Houthi-controlled Yemen. They're continuing, they keep bombing Yemen, and it's just not doing anything. So this is interesting. There was a new poll from Reuters Ipsos last week that found the majority of Democratic voters prefer a presidential candidate who doesn't support military aid to Israel. Another sign that President Biden's unconditional support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza could cost him in November. The poll shows that 56% of respondents who identified as Democrats were less likely to support a candidate who backs military aid, while 40% were more likely to support such a candidate. The results were more evenly split across the board, taking into account Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It found 40% of American voters, of all voters, would be less likely to support a pro-Israel military aid candidate, while 47% were more likely to support such candidate. And Republicans, the majority of them favor a candidate who wants to give military aid to Israel. 62% said that they do favor a pro-Israel candidate. 34% said they would be less likely to support a candidate like that. So President Biden, of course, is expected to run against Trump. That seems to be inevitable if Biden can make it till November. And both of them are staunch Israel supporters. Obviously, we all know Biden is because of everything he's been doing. But Trump, was before Biden. He gave Israel everything that they wanted. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the policy on settlements in the West Bank, recognizing the annexation of Golan Heights, many things like that. So, there's no reason to think that Trump is going to be any better than Biden here. And Biden is facing a wave of criticism and protest from within the Democratic Party over his unconditional support for the Israeli massacre in Gaza. This is another one from Kyle. This one's at the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky criticized his Western supporters for not providing enough aid. He said? I'll just read his quote here. He said, quote, "When lives are lost and partners are simply playing internal political games or disputes that limit our defense, it's impossible to understand. It's unacceptable, and it will be impossible to forget. The world will remember this," end quote. So, of course, he's not happy with the U.S. that he hasn't gotten the $61 billion in new aid that Biden wants Congress to pass to fuel this war for another year.
Act worthy of yourselves. That was the message from Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the great heroes of the American Revolutionary War. That's what he urged the people to do when remembering the massacre in Boston, which was tomorrow in history, March 5th, 1770. And this was, if you're not familiar already, this was one of the most significant events that turned colonial sentiment against the British more generally, and also cemented their opposition to standing armies particularly. Here's how Warren described things that they were facing in 1775. He painted a picture of what they once again faced some years later. He said, "Our streets are again filled with armed men. Our harbor is crowded with ships of war, but these cannot intimidate us. Our liberty must be preserved. It is far dearer than life." This is the great patriot again, Joseph Warren, Revolutionary War hero, who's telling us, like, liberty or death, really, is what he's saying here. And he goes on, he says, "We hold it even dear as our allegiance. We must defend it against the attacks of friends as well as enemies. Liberty is the primary object. Liberty is the goal, and our allegiance to no nation on earth should supplant our love of liberty," is really what he's getting to. And he's even saying we cannot even suffer the Britons to ravish it from us. And this was a speech given on what they used to call Massacre Day. They didn't call it the Boston Massacre. They referred to it as Massacre Day. And it was so important in the Boston area during the American Revolution, that is the run-up to the War for Independence, that it was commemorated as kind of a solemn public holiday in the area with speeches from prominent patriots. But let's get to some highlights from Dr. Joseph Warren's second Massacre Day oration, or second speech, keynote speech, the only person to ever deliver it twice. This was on March 6th, 1775. The 5th was a Sunday that year, so they did not do this type of thing on Sundays, so they held the event the following day on Monday. Of course, as he did in his 1772 speech, he really kicks it off with a natural rights view. This was the view, our rights come from our Creator, we do not get our rights as a gift from government, and he opened with that. Voluntary association and natural rights. Pretty fascinating stuff and pretty hardcore, especially for the time. That personal freedom, he said, is the natural right of every man, and that property or an exclusive right to dispose of what he has honestly acquired by his own labor necessarily arises therefrom, are truths which common sense has placed beyond the reach of contradiction. Again, so this is a very important truth for today, but the population at large is so far from this type of perspective, that our rights come from our Creator, that natural rights and personal freedom, this is what our birthright, and we also have exclusive property rights in what we earn. So this is not a mentality that a vast majority of people have today, but this was widely accepted by many people in Boston, at least at the time, Virginia as well. And he said, and no man or body of men can, without being guilty of flagrant injustice, claim a right to dispose of the persons or acquisitions of any other man or body of men, unless it can be proved that such a right has arisen from some compact between the parties in which it has been explicitly and freely granted. Halfway there. I mean, he's getting there. It's a really interesting approach. And then he went into kind of because he's talking about how the only way you can claim this type of power is if you have proof that we've agreed to it. And he then goes through some history of the early settlement there in Boston and Massachusetts, which was intended, Aaron writes, to determine this is how Warren put it, determine with what degree of justice the late Parliament of Great Britain has assumed the power of giving away that property which the Americans have earned by their labor. So by working with the soil, by working in shops, by creating and building things, what they earned was their own, and Parliament had no right to take even a portion of it. He said, when the measures of administration had disgusted the colonies to the highest degree, and the people of Great Britain had by artifice and falsehood been irritated against America, an army was sent over to enforce submission to certain acts of the British Parliament, which reason scored to countenance, and which placemen and pensioners were found unable to support. So people who didn't have much money either were also getting pretty screwed over. And then, of course, what did the British do? They sent armies to enforce their will. They thought the people were too uppity and they had to be put down. And this is where they were finding themselves once again in 1775. He said, martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always, this was not considered a new thing. This was from a long understanding in both American and British history, and I've covered this in other episodes. I should have had this one handy, but this was a widely understood maxim that standing armies were always dangerous. And here was a man of a man willing to fight, unlike most anyone alive today. We'll get to that near the end of the show. Martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always been considered as improper to quarter troops in populous cities. Frequent disputes must necessarily arise between the citizen and the soldier, even if no previous animosities subsist. And he said, and it is further certain from a consideration of the nature of mankind, as well as from constant experience, that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. It's not sometimes, it's not once in a while, it's not only in emergencies or extreme cases, it's not just over there, it's not just dictators, it's literally in every situation. Here's the war hero telling us that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject.
The Supreme Court ruling, a unanimous ruling that states cannot remove presidential candidates from the ballot. Jim, have you seen it, and what are your thoughts on it?
I have seen it. I haven't had a chance to digest it in detail, but read through it quickly. I think this was expected. I think it's good that it was unanimous. I've been saying all along that Plan A for November was to keep Trump off the ballot. I think there's still a little wiggle room with regard to maybe a state conviction, but I think that wiggle room for the states that want to keep him off the ballot is pretty narrow at this point. So at this point, I think they're going to resort to Plan B, which is to go back to the kind of shenanigans we saw in 2020. But right now, yeah, I think for what is left of an American constitutional system, this is a very significant development.
It seems like they're getting backed in a corner now. Everything they try to throw at Trump, and neither of us are Trump fans necessarily. We love the fact that he has the best enemies, being the worst people. But everything they try to throw at him is not sticking. Obviously, it's rebounding, it's ricocheting. But you're right, I think, Jim, that the fact that this was a unanimous decision takes a lot of the wind out of their sails.
It does. And look, I supported Trump in 2016. I'm supporting him this year. I don't have any illusions about him. There's a lot about him I like. There's some things I don't like. I especially, as you say, dislike the people who hate him. So that's worth something. And I think one thing he says that's true is that when he says to his adoring fans that it's not so much me that they hate, it's you that they hate. That's absolutely true. I mean, there are just a lot of lumpen Americanos out there in flyover country who idolize him, and for the same reason they idolize him as the orange savior, his detractors hate him as the orange Hitler because of the kind of people who like him. And unfortunately, I don't think that even if he does win, I think the odds of that are actually rather small, but even if he does win, I don't think he'll be any more successful in changing the course of what is an increasingly dysfunctional remnant or vestige of a constitutional system.
Says, just to round up, French president warns of EU ground intervention in Ukraine. British Prime Minister confirms UK military personnel on the ground in Ukraine. German Air Force chief says U.S. military personnel are on the ground in Ukraine assisting with missile launches. So to me, Jim, it sounds like we are moving closer to that area where some foul-up could end up in a disaster.
Exactly right. And, I don't know Mike Tracy only slightly, but I respect a lot of the work he does. And I think that he's very pithy the way he put that together. And again, well, we're just sending a few advisors to Vietnam. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, and here, except it's a nuclear armed state, and one that is right on its front doorstep here. I mean, there's no way these people can prevail. Now, there are some people who think now that what really they're shooting for is some kind of a frozen conflict, one where the Russians can be tied down and bled white for years on end, no matter if there's a single Ukrainian left or if there's any European economy left. I don't know what they think they're doing, but like we were saying earlier with Trump, he can't admit where he was wrong, and these people can't admit where they were wrong. They cannot find some way to climb off of the out of the tree that they've gotten themselves pushed up into. And I just don't know where this goes unless at some point the Russians decide simply, look, the comedy must end. We must put an end to this militarily. And if the other side does something stupid, well, then they do. But they've got to roll those dice. If I were in their shoes.
Yeah, and let's not forget, these people have dedicated their entire careers to taking out Russia. People like Newland and Blinken and Sullivan and the others. Well, let's move on to our last topic, because I just wanted to talk to you about this, because I find it fascinating, which is what's happening with Gaza and Israel right now. And all of our viewers hopefully they go beyond the mainstream. We know that there have been, and even Austin, Secretary of Defense, said before Congress that 25,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military. There was a horrific scene last week where a bunch of Palestinians were rushing to an aid truck to get some food because they're starving, and they were mowed down by the Israelis. Horrific scenes. We know for a fact, obviously, that we give a lot of money to Israel and we give a lot of weapons, and that's why a lot of the reason we're talking about it. But Jim, here is a situation. The Biden administration seems to be so paralyzed by what's happening there. The world is disgusted and outraged at what's happening. And here you have the Biden administration controlling the levers, essentially, of Israel's power with our power of the purse and the power of the bombs, and incapable of doing anything as a famine threatens 2 million people. So what do the geniuses come up with? Let's drop 30,000 meals by air onto the ground to feed 2.5 million starving civilians. I was thinking of Jesus with the 5 loaves and fishes. It's not going to work. I mean, have you ever? You've been a diplomat. In diplomatic history, has there ever been a situation where a close American ally refuses to allow humanitarian aid through their territory?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I can't say that didn't happen, but I certainly can't think of a case. And you're right, 30,000 meals, and it's not 30,000 days per person. That's one meal per day, for 30,000 people, and just total drop in the bucket. And you do have to wonder. I've seen some reference that, well, once these things drop in and people start to gather this food, are the Israelis going to target them? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it seems pretty clear that the destroy Amalek mentality is pretty strong in the Israeli government right now. Now, does that mean that they think they can still continue with this operation in Gaza and actually beat Hamas, or is it really more aimed at simply clearing the people out of there? They're going to try to push them into Egypt. How are the Egyptians going to handle that? And of course, there's more and more talk that the Israelis are going to launch an attack against Hezbollah in Lebanon. You'd think, given how much they've got their hands full in Gaza, both militarily and in terms of the black eye they're taking in terms of the public the world perceptions of the operation, they would want to keep that northern front as quiet as possible. It doesn't seem that that's what they want, and the only reason I can think that they would want to move forward against Hezbollah is that somehow it's going to drag the United States directly into the conflict.
Atomism, therefore, says Epicurus, relieves us of our 2 main fears. But it brings up a new problem and a new fear, namely determinism. I'm here presenting Epicurus. It takes away the fear of the gods. We are no longer pawns of the gods, but, says Epicurus, are we now to be a pawn of the laws of mechanics? Are we now passive robots without free will, reacting simply to the inexorable laws of physics without any control over our own destinies? Have we escaped one tyranny, the tyranny of the gods, simply to embrace an equal tyranny, the tyranny of mechanics? We must, says Epicurus, find a place for free will within the framework of a materialistic, atomistic philosophy. Now, how are we going to do this? Inasmuch as there is no such thing as mind, apart from atoms, which is capable of making choices. How can you have free will on a materialist metaphysics? Well, to understand his answer, let us leave this issue for a moment and look briefly at Epicurus's physics, then we'll return. At one point, trying to explain the origin of the world, Epicurus hypothesized that a long time ago, when the atoms were in their most primitive state, before they combined into worlds, they were merely falling down in straight lines, sort of like a steady rain of atoms. He thought this because he, of course, knew nothing about the law of gravity. He thought that atoms had weight as an inherent property, that they had a certain heaviness, just the way they have a certain shape in themselves. And as such, he thought left to their own devices, they would just fall straight down, because that's things with weight, as we observe here on Earth, fall straight down if unimpeded. Now his problem was, from this initial rain of atoms, how to get the atoms together to make worlds. We need some collisions among the atoms. Now, I should say that since they were in a vacuum, since they were traveling through the void, they all, he thought, fall at the same speed, so none of them would ever catch the others. The question is, how would they get together? We know they must have got together because they now exist in all kinds of combinations. Well, he said there's only one way. If it were the case that every once in a while certain atoms could move sideways, ever so little, just enough to collide with an adjoining line of falling atoms, and start a component of motion in the sideways direction, we would thereby generate all sorts of collisions the various atoms would smash into and away from each other, and ultimately, by strict mechanical laws, we'd bring about all the combinations that create the world of shoes and ships and sealing wax and people and planets, etc. The problem then is to get certain atoms moving sideways. Now Epicurus asked himself, why would they ever do this? By all the laws of physics, they should merely go down. That's what their weight dictates. Yet they must go sideways. But there's no reason for them to go sideways. Well, given this dilemma, Epicurus took the bull by the horns. And he said, every once in a while, for no reason, not that we don't know the reason, but that even if we were omniscient, there would be no reason, no cause. Every once in a while, some of these little atoms lurch to the side. This is completely causeless, sheer chance, metaphysically, an uncaused event. The atoms, so to speak, occasionally go on a metaphysical bender. Now, these uncaused, exceptional, sideways lurches are called Epicurean swerves. And it represents the abandonment of the universal law of cause and effect. Most of the time, of course, the atoms obey the laws of mechanics and are lawful, but occasional swerves are possible. Now, in the swerve, Epicurus thought he had the solution to the problem of free will and determinism. Because, he says, it's not true that we are pawns of inexorable laws. Our soul atoms also can swerve causelessly. They can break the laws of mechanics. They can escape their billiard ball destiny by periodically lurching causelessly. And as such, we are free to act in defiance of causal laws. And we are therefore in control of our behavior. We have free will. Now, this is the view that free will requires the denial of causality. And it is known technically as indeterminism. Determinism with the prefix in. That is defined as the view that causality is not universal and that free will requires a breach of causality. If determinism is the view that everything is inevitable, nothing could ever happen any differently, man has no choice, indeterminism comes back with, yes, he has, because there are no iron-bound laws of reality. Causeless swervings can occur. Now I observe here that this is, in fact, a hopeless theory. Although it's not at all uncommon, many subsequent philosophers have taken their cue from Epicurus on this issue. For instance, Kant, or William James, many of the existentialists, many of the disciples of the physicist Werner Heisenberg, and they have tried to defend free will by an attack on cause and effect. So it's not in any way restricted to Epicurus or atomism. I say that this is a hopeless position because, among many other reasons, a human being has no more control over his actions on the theory of indeterminism than on the theory of determinism. You are no more responsible for actions which are causeless than for actions which are determined from all eternity by forces outside your control. Now, for instance, suppose I were to walk casually by, minding my own business, and my arm lurches out and stabs someone in the path, and that is a causeless event. And I'm then hailed before the judge to account for my behavior. I would have a perfect right to say, why bring it up to me? I was minding my own business. And this Epicurean swerve took place. In other words, free will and self-responsibility cannot be salvaged by abandoning causality. Now, I assume that the correct position on this issue you know, as it's covered extensively in the objectivist literature. If there are any questions on how, in fact, you do reconcile free will and cause and effect, I'll be glad to discuss that in the question period. For our purposes during the lecture, I simply want you to know that Epicurus is one of the main originators of the attempt to equate free will with causeless action, and thus one of the main philosophers to put the concept of free will in disrepute. So much for his metaphysics. His epistemology is without value, or particular originality, or influence, so we will simply ignore it. And let us look now at Epicurus' ethics.
And with that, I will yield up to 3 minutes to my good friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massie.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to give the American people an overview of the debate that's happening here today. Why are there 3 members of Congress controlling time on the floor? I thought there were only 2 parties. Nope. When it comes to spending, there's the uniparty. There is only one party. So today, that is because Republicans and Democrats have united to kick the can down the road. They wanted to control all time for debate today, but my colleague, Mr. Roy from Texas, came down here and used a parliamentary procedure so that the people who take their oath to the Constitution most seriously, the people who are most concerned about debt, the people who want to represent the good folks back home, have a voice here today because of my colleague Chip Roy, who's claimed 20 minutes in opposition. And what are we doing here today? Well, we're going to pass a CR. We're going to kick the can down the road. Is that going to solve any problems? No, it creates another crisis next week. You see, that's what they want, another crisis. They want to threaten you with the shutdown so they can get more spending. But is this a clean CR? We're told you can't add anything to it? No, it deals with student aid in this CR. Do the American people, are they concerned about student aid right now? Is that the most pressing issue to address in this spending bill? We have a crisis at the southern border. We could add one sentence to this bill that would help tremendously. Just say none of the funds hereby appropriated may be used to disassemble border security erected by the states on our border. Put that one sentence in this continuing resolution. That would help tremendously. I am worried that we're not going to prevail today. The third group who is debating here against the uniparty. And if the other side prevails, what will happen? What will happen today, this evening, after this passes? Will we stay here and work hard for another week to get the 12 bills done, the 12 separate appropriations bills? No. Guess what we're going to do this evening? Everybody's already got their plane tickets. They're sending us home early. Congratulations. You moved the crisis down another week. Go home. Have a 4-day weekend. We're going to let staff and a few members in the Senate and a few members in the House write this big bill, and then you can take it or leave it next week. Gone is any semblance of regular order from this process. What we have is what the swamp always does. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this continuing resolution that does nothing but kick the can down the road. And I yield back to my colleague from Texas.
According to the Federal Reserve, credit card delinquencies increased by 50% in 2023, while consumer debt grew to $17.5 trillion. A recent survey by Cleaver Real Estate found that 3 in 5 Americans have credit card debt, and that 23% of Americans increase their credit card debt every month. The survey also found that 48% of Americans, including 59% of millennials, use credit cards for essential living expenses. The over-reliance on credit cards and the accompanying increase in consumer debt are consequences of our fiat monetary system. Since Richard Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold in August of 1971, the dollar's value has declined by 87% based on the government's understated consumer price index numbers. This means that even though Americans' nominal wages have increased, their real wages have declined as their dollars buy less. The continuing erosion of the dollar's value makes it impossible for many Americans to accumulate meaningful savings. Those Americans who can save may actually lose money by doing so, thanks to the Federal Reserve's inflation tax that erodes the value of savings. This is why Congress has felt it necessary to provide tax incentives to encourage saving for things like retirement, education, and health care. Congress could help protect Americans from the inflation tax by forbidding the Federal Reserve from purchasing government debt instruments such as Treasury securities. However, since this would end Congress's ability to run up huge deficits, thus forcing to pare back the welfare warfare state, it is unlikely such legislation would pass. The reliance of so many Americans on credit cards for basic necessities is one reason why many Americans are dissatisfied with the economy. The large amount of consumer debt is also a reason the Federal Reserve will not increase interest rates to anywhere near what they would be in a free market. The problem is compounded by the fact that investors and businesses have become addicted to near zero or at zero interest rates. The Fed's relatively modest rate increases over the last couple years caused many experts to warn that the Fed was going to throw the economy into a recession. The Fed, though, has been able to claim recession has been avoided because the Fed kept the rates relatively low and because government statistics are manipulated to understate the real rates of unemployment and inflation. This will either be caused by or result in a rejection of the dollar's world reserve currency status. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket and consumers and businesses that have been relying on debt to cope with the Fed's dollar destruction will find the piper at their doors, demanding to be paid. The economic crisis will be worsened by the moral crisis caused by the belief among too many Americans at all levels of society that they have a right to government-provided economic security at the expense of their fellow citizens. This will result in violence and the growth of authoritarian political movements. The collapse of the fiat money system and the accompanying welfare warfare state also provides an opportunity for those of us who understand the truth to build a society based on and around the principles of liberty. We must continue our efforts to reach a critical mass of people with the message of liberty while making plans to ensure our families can take care of themselves when the next crash hits. Thanks for listening.
So British soldiers are on the ground in Ukraine helping Ukrainian forces fire Storm Shadow missiles. And this is according to a leaked recording of a conversation between German military officers that was published by Russian media. And Germany confirmed the authenticity of this recording, and the British did not dispute this claim. The UK actually confirmed last week that it had a small number of troops inside Ukraine who they said were supporting the armed forces of Ukraine. So recently there's been all this talk about NATO troops, the potential of sending NATO troops to Ukraine, which put a lot of attention on the fact that there are already at least a small number of NATO special operations forces in Ukraine. And now this is more evidence of that. And it really goes to show how involved NATO is in this war. So these Storm Shadow missiles, the UK first started sending them to Ukraine last year, and it was a big deal. It was a big escalation because they have a range of 155 miles, which was further than any other NATO-provided missile. And I know that they've used these to hit targets deep inside Crimea and things like that. And France has also provided Ukraine with a French variant of the Storm Shadow known as the Scalp missile. But according to these German military officers, France does not have troops actually. Well, according to some of the leaks, France does have special operations troops in Ukraine. But these German officers said France did not have troops helping with the firing these missiles on the ground. So in this recording, it was the head of the German Air Force who described how the British assist Ukraine. He said, quote, "When it comes to mission planning, I know how the English do it. They do it completely in reach back. They also have a few people on the ground. They do that. The French don't," end quote. So they were discussing as well the possibility of Germany providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles, which would double Ukraine's strike capabilities because they can hit targets up to 300 miles away. So that would be a huge escalation. In this conversation, again, this leaked conversation of German military officers that's been confirmed to be real by the Germans, these officers say that Taurus missiles could likely be used to blow up the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland and has been attacked twice by Ukraine. The Kremlin said that the leaked conversation, quote, "makes it clear that plans to carry out strikes inside Russia are under discussion within the German military," end quote. U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein said on Monday that a truce in Gaza will not necessarily extend to Lebanon as Israel and Hezbollah continue to trade fire across the border. So Hochstein said, quote, "It does not necessarily happen that when you have a ceasefire in Gaza, it just automatically extends," end quote. Sources close to Hezbollah have said that they would likely halt attacks on Israel if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. And as I've mentioned quite a bit, you have Israel threatening that they're going to escalate in Lebanon if there is a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as a result of a potential hostage deal. And another thing is that the U.S. doesn't talk directly with Hezbollah. They talk to the Lebanese government in Beirut. And Hezbollah is, part of the government in the parliament, but, he's speaking with the prime minister. I believe he spoke with a leader in the parliament as well. And he was warning against escalations on the Israel-Lebanon border. He said the only solution to this is a diplomatic deal. But so far, it doesn't seem like Lebanon, and not just Hezbollah, but Lebanon, is not happy with the proposals that the U.S. and France has also put forward some stuff, because all it is basically Hezbollah withdrawing from the border and no concessions from Israel. So we'll see how this all plays out. And as I covered recently, U.S. officials have told CNN that they expect Israel to launch an invasion of southern Lebanon if there is no diplomatic deal. And that report said that Israel would not be happy with just Hezbollah moving back from the border. They want something more than that. So that sounds like it sounds like they're pretty far apart on what they want for a deal. So on Monday, Idaho State Senate passed the Defend the Guard Act, legislation that would prohibit the deployment of the state's National Guard to a combat zone without a declaration of war from Congress, as required by the Constitution. The bill was introduced in January by Senator Ben Adams and passed in a vote of 27-8, which is pretty good. 27-8, that's not bad. Now it heads to the state's House of Representatives for consideration. I think there's some confidence that it will do well in the House, which is great. So Idaho's Senate is the third state legislature to approve the Defend the Guard Act. This follows New Hampshire and Arizona. So those are two states where it could potentially become law. So far, no state has made it law yet, but this Defend the Guard Act, this is a relatively young project, and they're making a lot of big strides here. This article is from The Gray Zone from Jeb Sprague and Kit Clarenberg. This seems like a pretty big deal. A classified diplomatic cable that was obtained by The Gray Zone reveals the role of a veteran CIA officer in violently overthrowing Haiti's popular president in 2004. So basically, there was a jailbreak in Haiti in August 2002 that saw a bulldozer smash through the local prison walls, allowing these armed supporters of opposition actually a gang leader in Haiti to get out. And that prison break ultimately led to the 2004 coup. And the documents released to the Gray Zone under a FOIA reveal that the jailbreak was part of a complex U.S. intelligence operation aimed at undermining Aristide's presidency, the president at the time. And at the heart of this operation was Janice L. Elmore, a CIA operative working undercover as a Department of State political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Haiti at the time. So there's a lot of details in this article. And this is important just because U.S. intervention in Haiti, Western intervention in Haiti, has a very dark history.
So this pendulum swinging back and forth is always, I think, something that unfortunately just seems to naturally happen. And it's interesting that, so do you think, so Berkeley has just clearly gone more and more, just continued to go further left and further authoritarian since you were there?
Yeah, I would say authoritarian. The left and right doesn't really work, I mean, one of the big problems, Kim, is the fact that we have a systemic politicization of our entire society. Politics is entirely too important. So you have a situation where the Democrats wanted to get Trump kicked off the ballot. You had highly partisan Democrats working in these positions, most of them put in power by very wealthy, left-wing activists, named George Soros. So what they did, we want to take Trump off the ballot. The conservative response was not, that is un-American. The conservative response was, oh yeah, well, we're going to take Biden off of our ballots. So you're missing the point. It's not about politics. It's about principles. Are we a free society? Or are we the kind of society where you take people off the ballot? I mean, I thought that's what we complained about Iran for, is that they have like this religious guard that, that decides who can run for the president. Well, they're adopting that same thing. So the problem really is that politics is too prevalent in our society. And one of the ways I experienced this, I spent the 90s living in Hungary. I moved there right after communism fell. And so there was a huge hangover of communism there. And I can tell you, even among families, your politics is what defined you. This side of our family, they were in the Communist Party. Oh, this side were in the opposition. And it was visceral. And I thought, thank God we're not like that in the US. But then I got home, almost 10 years later, and it became like that. So it's just the problem is when government gets huge like that, it's a jealous God. It takes over every aspect of your society. So you have to fight for all the goods that only government, quote unquote, can provide. So that's the root of the problem.
And you're right, rather than it being about principles, it's about politics, and that's causing a huge, huge division in this country. And I think you're right on about that.
That's why I said back in 2006, I'm not going to vote for anyone. So I just stopped voting.
Do you vote now?
I don't vote. No, I haven't voted since 2004, I think.
You're kidding me.
No, I don't want to take any part in it whatsoever.
But I mean, voting is how you change it.
Really? I
would hope.
The lesser of two evils.
Well, I mean, if you and I both voted, and if we both got two people, and then those two people got two people, and it spread like that, then maybe we could make a change.
I've been watching too many of those PBS children's shows about how a bill becomes a law or something. I mean, I work there. It doesn't work that way. But
how are we going to change things, though? I mean, so if you don't think it's through voting, why do you think it's not through voting?
Well, because it's through education. I mean, a moral society starts way before the ballot box. We have to return to being a moral society. And that's why I think even Dr. Paul said about abortion. Well, you can outlaw it, but you have to change the hearts and minds of people, because there's something wrong in a society that wants to kill children. There's something wrong in a society that wants to do this, that, or the other. So voting is only outward expression, of your membership in a club, or of your philosophy, or what have you. That's only the outward expression of it. So the content of your character is really what's the most important part. And that's why, especially at the Ron Paul Institute, we spend all of our time opposing war overseas, opposing U.S. interventionism, and standing up for civil liberties at home. And
it's people are starting to really open their eyes, and I think it's a wise stance. That's the way I'm pro people, right? I just want people to be free and to be able to live together. And I think that those two groups of people have to work it out.
Yeah.
But the way they cannot work it out when one group is so heavily oppressed by the other militarily through occupation and everything that goes on in their daily lives. It's terrible.
It doesn't work. We've seen that it doesn't work. It doesn't make Israel any safer. Quite the contrary. If anything, it stimulated every country around Israel to develop higher and higher tech weapons.
Yeah.
To the point where Iran is a very sophisticated. Apparently, I mean, they claim they have hypersonic weapons. They may well have them. So that's stimulated that. Whereas, but this all comes back to U.S. foreign policy, and that's the whole point that we try to make. If the U.S. hadn't provided a moral hazard, what they say in economics, to Israel, a moral hazard is that we will cash any check you write. If we had not provided that, then Israel wouldn't have been able to go around kicking sand in everyone's faces and taking their land. They would have had to say, well, we are in a rough neighborhood. We're going to have to try to find a way to deal with this situation. How can we do this? Instead, they say, well, Uncle Sam's going to fight our battles for us. We've already sent how many thousands and thousands of guided weapons to kill people standing in line for bread, now in Gaza. So really, the problem is more the U.S. And I think it stimulates extremism in Israel. I mean, when Netanyahu was first elected in I think it was 96, I mean, I was living in Hungary and I thought, this is cool. He's a conservative. He's a cool guy. But he's a right winger. But now he's a moderate. He's actually a liberal in Israel now. So that shows how far things come when you radicalize a population. Just like, when you have someone used to welfare in the U.S., they're not going to go out and work because they're taken care of. They're subsidized. If you subsidize something, you'll get more of it. Well, we subsidize extremism in Israel. And so we're seeing where that leads.
How do you describe yourself politically if you're not a libertarian?
Traditionalist.
Traditionalist. What is that?
I mean, I'm not into politics as
That's what I was just going to ask you. Are you an anarchist? I mean, are you like but how is that not a libertarian if it's like just buck the entire system? That to me seems to be what libertarianism is. What's Ron Paul?
I don't know. I don't think he would call himself a libertarian. But he doesn't like that term very much. But for me, for some people, libertarianism is an all-encompassing philosophy. It's almost like a substitute for religion. You look up in your little book, okay, here's that issue. This is how we solve it. I don't view it that way. I view it as a tactical move, because for me, I happen to be a religious person, and so I view the state encroaching on my religion. It steals half of my money. It tells me what I can do. It tells me where I can live. Over and over, it listens into me. So I want to shrink the state because I think there should be a larger sphere in the United States for your personal life. Now, you may be religious like I am, and maybe I want to start a religious commune. Well, what's going to happen? The IRS is going to come knocking. You're going to have the ATF coming in, like Branch Davidians and blowing us up, and everything. Right. I mean, so I want to shrink the state so people have more, have more space in their world for whatever it is they want, as long as Dr. Paul says, don't harm anyone, don't hurt anyone, don't kill anyone, and don't steal their stuff.
My big thing is I think libertarians need to learn a conservative lesson and conservatives need to learn a libertarian lesson. And I think the libertarians need to learn like a conservative cultural lesson, that it's like you can have the attitude that people are free and ought to be able to do what they want as long as they're not, violently imposing on other people. But that doesn't mean you have to celebrate degeneracy. That doesn't mean you have to be on this. That doesn't mean you can't have and in fact, if government's not going to regulate things, then you kind of need social stigmas to regulate things. So I'm like very pro shaming and judgmental culture. But I think conservatives really need to learn a libertarian lesson about the role of government, because the whole game right now, and this is what I really think is missing from the Trumpist populist movement, is that Trump talks about drain the swamp. And that resonates so much with everybody because everyone knows this whole system is so corrupt. And obviously it is. I mean, look, the most millionaires in the country are in Washington, D.C. And the richest counties are all the suburbs that surround Washington, D.C. And why? That's not capitalism. It's not because, there's these great big factories that make all the things in Washington, D.C. It's not Silicon Valley's in Washington, D.C. or some center of industry. And, the other richest counties are all outside of New York City. But that's not capitalism. They're not producing anything. That's just because Nixon took us off the gold standard and now you have this fiat money casino there. But anyway, my point is, draining the swamp means drastic cuts in federal spending. And if you don't have that, you're never draining the swamp. That's the whole corruption right there. The reason why there's so many millionaires in Washington, D.C. is because our central federal government spends $6 trillion a year.
Yeah, well, D.C. is a brothel, is what I say. D.C. is a brothel. Yeah. It's a bunch of prostitutes in Congress that shake their butts for the highest spender, right? And that is what happened with Big Pharma. When they want to get something passed, we have more Big Pharma lobbyists than we have congressmen on the Hill. Yeah. The idea of even being able to lobby, how could you not think that that is going to lead to corruption? And you are absolutely correct. And you do not have to, say, and not to drag on Trump, because that we need to have the freedom. If we're ever going to get to a solution, we need to have the freedom to say that this person is not perfect. This person is not perfect, to be able to have a full conversation to stop this weird idea that if you are a person, you are either all good or all bad. Even that is a form of psychology that drives me crazy. Like if I tweeted right now that Stalin said 2 + 2 = 4 and I agree, they would be like, Candace Owens is supporting Stalin. No, sometimes even somebody that you disagree with can say something that is correct.
Right. And it doesn't mean you have to like give up your entire identity. I'm not like saying that to conservatives. And I'm not saying you can't respect the fact that Donald Trump came around and said some really important things and was totally right about immigration and foreign policy. And he got so much heat for this, but he was totally right that all these wars were stupid and that having open borders is unsustainable and you can't have a nation without a border and all of that stuff. He was right. He was right when he questioned NATO. And also he was framed by his own intelligence agency as committing treason. Like he was framed for treason by his own intelligence communities. Like all of that's true. But then also it's true that he totally failed to drain the swamp. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And let's look at that. Like, okay, he appointed so many of the wrong people. Like, truth is that, you know, he was just talking about building the FBI a new building. Like, these are the people who framed you for treason, man. They literally attempted a coup in the United States of America. They tried to overthrow the guy. Andrew McCabe said on 60 Minutes, he said that we sat around and they had a meeting at the Department of Justice, the top people, about whether to invoke the 25th Amendment. Like they were talking about how do we remove this guy? And then they realized they couldn't get enough of the cabinet. So they settled on Mueller.
Yeah. What's interesting about why we're at this moment now where people are starting to question the government, for the first time ever, they kept us in the dark, so to speak, and I'm just saying this as like a public school education 9/11 type kid, about what we were doing overseas intentionally while convincing us that we were receiving an education. We actually weren't really receiving an education. We were receiving marching orders. Mm-hmm. And then for the first time, because of Trump, which is why I am so grateful that Donald Trump was president of the United States, because it led to this awakening, they turned the guns on the American people. They've never done it before, right? They've never done what they did on January 6th. And so now American people, when they're being called terrorists, it makes you go back and you go, well, if you're calling an American a terrorist for supporting a president, if you're calling an American a terrorist for exercising their right to free speech, what about all those other people you told us were terrorists and this was the reason that we needed to go overseas and drop some bombs? This is how it's starting to work in the American psyche. We're working backwards now.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. Like, these are people who are really comfortable with supporting wars where hundreds of thousands of people die because it enriches their friends. And just if you could get yourself into that mentality, if you're that callous, but what we feel like, yeah, but they would never do that to us or something. You know what I mean? It's like, it's almost like if you found out someone was like a pedophile and you let them babysit your kids and you were like, well, they did that to other kids in Iraq. You know what I mean? But they wouldn't do that to my kids here. It's like, no, I think the lesson is that person will be nowhere near my kids. And so I think that Donald Trump really, I think it was more symbolic than anything else. But he represented such a repudiation of the establishment and telling the American people that they are so corrupt and so stupid and have totally, mismanaged the United States of America. And in a sense, supporting that guy when everybody told you, like everybody at CNN told you, you're not allowed to, and you supported him anyway. That in their mind is like treason. Mm-hmm. That's like, oh, you're the enemy. So really, and if you look at this, it's not that there aren't really terrorists and there aren't really bad people all around the world. Most of the world is filled with them. But if you actually look at, like, say, the crimes of what Saddam Hussein committed, the crime of what Muammar Gaddafi committed, the crime of what Bashar al-Assad committed, it has nothing to do with what they tell you. It's not like Bashar al-Assad was killing all of his own people was the line. It's not that they're oppressive. We're in business with the Saudis. Mm-hmm. We're in business with Israel. The question isn't how oppressive are you to people who are helpless. The crime that they committed is that they were not on board with the American empire. They were not subservient to it. And this is the same issue that we have with Iran. It's the same issue with Vladimir Putin. And John Mearsheimer points this out, and he's one of the best guys to listen to on foreign policy about all this stuff. Totally brilliant guy. And he just knows everything. But he pointed out that you go back and find me a quote before the year 2015 about anybody saying that Vladimir Putin is an imperialist, anybody saying that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Anyway, find it. You're not going to find it anywhere. Okay, nobody was saying this because he's never said anything like that, and he's never demonstrated it. And this is after like the conflict in Georgia, and he had like a few little skirmishes like that. What happened is in 2015 he committed the ultimate crime, and what the ultimate crime was is he went into Syria when he was invited in by the government of Bashar al-Assad, and he denied America a regime change in Syria, and it worked.
And there's
and that's why they hate him.
It's a big story that broke this morning, and if you put on that first clip, this is the AP's take on it. Victoria Nuland, third highest ranking U.S. diplomat and critic of Russia's war in Ukraine, is retiring. Now, this is out of the blue. She's had a very high profile recent couple of weeks. She was in Kiev, and she gave a major talk at the CSIS neocon think tank in Washington, D.C., and in both of those, she said Russia should expect a few surprises coming up. She's been the biggest hawk there is, and all of a sudden, she's retiring. And some people have commented, well, she's only 62. As a government employee, that's a little young to retire. I don't know the details of it, but it seems like an abrupt departure, particularly for someone who's always said Russia's winning, I mean, Russia's losing, Ukraine is going to win. So if Ukraine is on the verge of winning, why would she miss her chance at a victory lap? That's the big question. But before we go into maybe more of the whys, just to remind people of what Victoria Nuland's role has been. Now, we'll take a deeper dive before, but in the context of Ukraine, put on the next clip. This is what she's most famous for. So there was massive demonstrations 10 years ago, almost to the week, in Ukraine, in Kiev. The people in the streets overthrew a democratically elected and universally recognized government in Ukraine. And in the midst of the chaos and violence, here comes a senior State Department employee and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine handing out cookies and showing signs of support, not to the government that we recognize, but to the rebels overthrowing the democratic order. And after that happened, put on this next picture, here she is smiling and laughing with unelected people that she helped get appointed to the coup government. So the thing is, Dr. Paul, if you can imagine, if we had, imagine if the January 6th riot, or whatever you want to call it, was actually an insurrection. And it really was. And these guys, instead of putting their feet on Nancy Pelosi's chair, they were really serious and had guns, and they were shooting people. Now imagine if the Chinese ambassador brought some Chinese diplomats right into the middle of it and stood in the middle of the Capitol and said, "Keep it going, guys. We're with you. We have some guns."
She's a loyal soldier herself,
yeah,
isn't she?
She is.
But the big thing is figuring out to whom is she so loyal. Yeah. She's not going to walk away. She's not going to fly in her jet and go someplace on vacation. Her life is maneuvering and manipulating the neocon message, which can be almost whatever it wants. It doesn't pick sides. It picks special interests and special privileges, and sometimes you never figure it out. But she's definitely been one that we can get a pretty good guess that you better be cautious if she's making any promises to you, because they're probably not sincere.
Yeah. No, you make a really good point, though, is that the neocons have been returning to their left-wing roots. That's where they came from. They were all Trotskyites. Their parents were Trotskyites in the 50s and 60s. They were Trotskyites. And you're right, they were misidentified as conservatives because they were espousing a robust foreign policy and a robust military policy. But the fact is that they're actually far left at heart. They believe in a global revolution instead of the global communist revolution under Trotsky, global democratic revolution now. And they've returned. Like Bill Kristol quit the Republican Party, hates the Republicans. It's the same with these. These are Democrats. They're like the Scoop Jackson pro-war Democrats. I want to do one other thing, because this sort of backs up what we were saying, which is don't rest so easy just because one person is gone. So Nuland is out. They've already announced her replacement, at least temporarily. Put this one up. This is from a Blinken statement. President Biden and I have asked Undersecretary for Management John Bass to serve as acting Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs until Nuland's replacement is confirmed. Well, who's John Bass? You wouldn't have heard of him. He's arcane. Before we go to that next clip, just remember, Nuland was evil because she served Strobe Talbot and Dick Cheney and backed up all of their wars. Well, who's John Bass? Put the next one up. This is from his State Department bio. Ambassador Bass's assignments have included service on Vice President Dick Cheney's staff and advisor to Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. So he has literally the identical background that Victoria Nuland has without the baggage. And here's the kicker, Dr. Paul. Put the next one. Here's what John Bass is best known for, or maybe not well enough known for. He's a former ambassador to Afghanistan who oversaw the U.S. withdrawal from that country. Now, I don't think anyone, I hate to blame him for this, I don't think anyone would point to our withdrawal from Afghanistan and say, that John Bass, he really knows how to organize things.
But the observers who will plan the next evacuation, they'll know he followed orders.
He followed orders.
They all left.
Yeah.
Then we'll count up the losses later on. But they do emphasize now, which is something they figure is appealing to the American people, that they left all the weapons behind, and all the bad people are going to get the weapons. But how many weapons have been left behind in Vietnam and Korea? Every place we go in, and that's irrelevant. Matter of fact, that's a plus for the military-industrial complex, because of course, all those old weapons, they weren't any good anyway. We got to get going. We're always coming up short. We don't have enough airplanes, enough ships, enough bombs. We don't have enough wars, is what they're really saying.
Speaking of Thomas Massie, he just put out a release today just reaffirming what a great leader he is. Representative Thomas Massie invites Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, to attend the State of the Union address. Now, I got a text from Gabriel when we were doing the show yesterday. He's up on Capitol Hill, tirelessly fighting for his brother's freedom. And it's great to see Thomas Massie making such a move on behalf of Julian Assange. And here's just a quote from it. Representative Thomas Massie announces that Mr. Gabriel Shipton, brother of imprisoned journalist Julian Assange, will be attending the State of the Union address as his guest. Mr. Shipton is a prominent advocate for Mr. Assange's release. Thomas Massie said the U.S. government's ongoing effort to prosecute Julian Assange threatens the First Amendment rights of Americans and should be opposed. During his term in office, I asked President Trump to pardon Mr. Assange, and I was disappointed by his failure to do so. It goes on, but there's a clip. So great move on Thomas Massie's part.
His ethics rests on what he took to be a basic observed fact of human behavior. Namely, that all men want only one fundamental thing in life: pleasure, or the avoidance of pain, for themselves. Now, this is supposed, in his viewpoint, to be a factual description of human psychology, the way people in fact behave, and necessarily behave by their nature as human. This is a view which many, many centuries later was christened psychological hedonism. Psychological hedonism. Hedonism, of course, from the stress on pleasure, the Greek for pleasure being hedone, and psychological hedonism because it claims to be a psychological description of human behavior. As such, this doctrine is not an evaluation. It doesn't say it's good or bad to pursue pleasure. It says simply that is how people are. Now, if you want a definition of psychological hedonism, it is the view that all men, by their very nature as men, necessarily pursue one and only one fundamental goal in all of their actions, namely, to gain as much pleasure and or as little pain as possible for themselves. This doctrine is therefore a species of a broader doctrine called psychological egoism, which maintains that all men by their nature are necessarily egoistic, but leaves open what in particular they're after. Psychological hedonism subscribes to that and says, and besides that, the particular thing they're after is pleasure. Now, on the basis of this doctrine, as I say, it was not enunciated, not called psychological hedonism at this time. That's a much later name for it. But on the basis of this doctrine, Epicurus formulates his ethical code. He reasons like this: if this is the way man is by nature, then ethics must build on this fact. There is no use telling man to act for something else if he has no alternative but to pursue his own selfish pleasure. And one advocate of this view put it this way. He said, suppose man were so built that the only thing he could care about was lemon pies. He would be a psychological lemon pieist. Well, if so, when you came to ethics, you'd have to say, if you're basing ethics on human nature, the supreme value is lemon pies. You would then become an ethical lemon pieist on the grounds that man has no choice. Consequently, we reach the doctrine known as ethical hedonism, which is now an evaluative doctrine, and it is defined as follows. Pleasure and pleasure alone is good in itself. Pain and pain alone is bad in itself. And everything else, every other candidate for value and virtue, is to be evaluated depending upon its pleasure-pain consequences. Putting it more briefly, ethical hedonism is the doctrine that pleasure is the standard of all ethical evaluation. And you see the relation between these two doctrines. Psychological hedonism is a description. Ethical hedonism erects an ethics on the basis of it. Epicurus subscribed to both, and the first was really the argument for the second, although he did not always very clearly differentiate between the two. Now, I'm not going to criticize these two during the lecture this evening. Both are false. I refer you to the objectivist literature, again, where they're covered. On ethical hedonism, there's a brief piece by me in one of the very early, I think, the first issue of the objectivist newsletter back in '62, and there's, of course, considerable discussion by Miss Rand of these topics. I'll take any further questions on these two doctrines in the question period. Also, if you're interested in the difference between hedonism and eudaimonism, that is to say, between ethics which take pleasure as the standard of value and ethics which take happiness as the standard of value, and how both of those differ from objectivism, which takes life as the standard of value, I will be glad to answer that in the question period also.
The big news on Tuesday is that Russia hawk, notorious Russia hawk, Victoria Nuland, is resigning from the State Department. So Victoria Nuland, who is most known for her role in the 2014 coup in Ukraine, will be retiring from the State Department in the coming weeks. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced this on Tuesday. So Nuland has worked as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs since 2021, which is considered the third highest spot in the State Department. And she served as the acting Deputy Secretary of State for a few months until the position was filled by Kurt Campbell, who's a China hawk. He's known very well as one of the most hawkish on China in the administration. Fortunately, they can't ever put any kind of non-hawk in these positions, but Nuland is the wife of Robert Kagan, who's one of the most influential American neoconservatives. He was part of the Project for a New American Century, the group of neocons credited with, hatching the plan for the invasion of Iraq. And Nuland has worked through multiple administrations. She was in the George W. Bush administration. She was actually a deputy foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney from 2003 to 2005. So that means during the invasion of Iraq, she was a foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney. So this is who we're dealing with here. And later she served as the U.S. representative to NATO in the Bush administration. In the Obama administration, Nuland worked as a State Department spokeswoman and then as an Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and that's where she supported the Maidan protests in Ukraine in 2013 and into 2014, which led to the overthrow of former President Viktor Yanukovych. And the most notorious thing about this is the leaked phone call between Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time. And they're discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government. Openly, well, not openly, it was a private phone call, I guess, but this was leaked, a damning piece of evidence of the U.S. meddling in that uprising and coup. And she's also, would show up to the protests. In one case, she handed out cookies. I mean, she was really the face of the U.S. regime change effort in Ukraine and the proxy war that has followed. She really is the face of it. There's a lot to say about Nuland. I don't want to spend a crazy amount of time on her, but she is responsible for some of the most reckless rhetoric during this whole thing. She threatened the Nord Stream pipelines before the Russian invasion. She said that the U.S. supports, Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. Lots of things. The latest thing I saw, she was on CNN recently and said that the U.S. is going to tighten the noose on Putin. And again, despite the reality on the ground on what's happening in Ukraine, that Ukraine is clearly losing this war, and Russia's military has just gotten bigger. So Nuland will be replaced by John Bass temporarily until they nominate someone. So John Bass is another career U.S. government official. I never heard of him. I saw Aaron Mate on Twitter pointing out that he also worked for Dick Cheney at one point in his career. And I looked at his biography on the State Department's website, and that's true. He worked on the staff of former Vice President Dick Cheney. So another neocon, it looks like, is going to be the acting official in this position for now. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. And a few days after U.S. and Haitian diplomats discussed sending U.S. Special Forces to Haiti to help Prime Minister Ariel Henry regain control over the capital city, a White House official dismissed the idea of deploying soldiers to the Caribbean nation. According to McClatchy, D.C., U.S. and Haitian diplomats held frantic conversations late last week that raised the prospect of an emergency deployment of U.S. Special Forces. On Monday, the outlet reported speaking with a White House National Security Council official who dismissed the possibility. So the U.S. is saying that they're not sending troops, but they are calling for this deployment. They want Kenya to lead an intervention force, a police force, into Haiti. So they want an intervention in Haiti. They don't want to send U.S. troops, I think, just because for PR purposes, the dark history of Western involvement. They want to send an African force over there. And things have really, for Henry, the prime minister, I'm not even sure if he's in Haiti right now. I know he was in Kenya when things started to really pop off. You have these gangs fighting, and then there's also this one group led by a guy named Jimmy Cherizer, who is also known as Barbecue. That's his nickname. And I know Dan Cohen, who is a journalist who covers Haiti a lot, and he says the characterization of Barbecue, I'm going to call him that because I might be butchering his last name. He is more of kind of leading an uprising against the government more than just being a gang leader. There are other gangs, criminal gangs, but his is more about an uprising against this government. And Henry came into power when the previous prime minister, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated. And he's just been in power ever since. So he wasn't elected, and he doesn't have popular support. So that's a big factor here. And just the U.S. has just got to stay out of Haiti's business. The West has got to stay out of Haiti's business. The UN has to stay out of it. It's just not going to. That thing I covered yesterday, the Gray Zone report that revealed the CIA involvement in the 2004 coup in Haiti. This goes back and back and back.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This is the big news. The pop star Taylor Swift told her fans Tuesday morning to participate in the Super Tuesday Republican and Democratic primaries across the country. Quote, I want to remind you guys to vote the people who most represent you in power. Why, you said remind you guys. How about the transgenders? What's wrong with his and he and she and her? And I cut off my tits and my balls. Why, you said guys. I think we should condemn Taylor Swift. But what a bunch of shit. I could give a fuck what she says. Yep. If you haven't already, make a plan to vote today. Vote for your repulsive kin. vote for your Democrat. Vote for the same fucking pieces of shit who steal our money and give it to the bigs, who steal our money and give it to the military-industrial complex, who tax the shit out of us. Don't forget to vote. Don't forget to vote. How fucking stupid could you be to vote for this shit? But here's what's really important, what's going on. It's one of your top trends, one of the top trends for 2024, and that's banks go bust. And we're starting to see that happen now. It's in your economic update. Get ready, banks go bust. With people being forced to work from home, many of the businesses that depended on commuters have gone out of business or are going bust. With the U.S. office vacancy rate at some 20%, is a clear illustration for all to see the devastation caused by the idiotic, arrogant, narcissistic, sociopathic politicians who impose these draconian lockdown mandates without a scintilla of scientific data to legitimize the actions. We're talking about the COVID war. As of February, according to Investopedia, the commercial mortgage delinquency rate increased 59% in the past year. You ready? Yesterday, Spectrum News in New York 1, reported, quote, the delinquency rate for office buildings in New York City has increased more than 1,000% from January 2023 to January 2024. The office vacancy rate in New York City, meaning no one in the place, is empty, according to Cushman Wakefield, is nearly 23%. So again, we warned you about the office building bust when they started locking things down. It was one of our top trends. And we warned you about the banks going bust. There's going to be defaults like you can't believe, and the death of the dollar is going to happen when they lower interest rates to artificially prop this up. The lower interest rates go, the deeper the dollar falls, and the higher gold prices rise, which are now at $2,125 as we go on the air. And what is one of your top trends for 2024? Take a look at it. It's all about gold, or one of them. Golden year for gold. CIA, U.S. Special Forces are in Ukraine advising Ukrainians. That's a report that came out. That's old news in your Trends Journal when we reported that they were saying that the United States was sending in advisors. What advisors? Showing them how to shoot these weapons. Again, we are on the cusp of something very big. Gold prices are going up for two reasons. The first one is they're going to lower interest rates, as we had forecast in the run-up to the presidential reality show. They're going to keep the clowns in charge, or they're going to try to, of course, because Janet Misfatja Bruta Yellen, the former Fed head, is now the Treasury Secretary running the fucking government, basically. You know, whoever got the money is running the show. They want to keep her there. And the other reason gold prices are going up is because intelligent people, those who read the Trends Journal and tune into our podcasts, know that, again, as interest rates go down with 70%, according to the CME data, the big guess is that 70% say they're going to be lowering by June. We believe earlier. The lower interest rates go, the deeper the dollar sinks. The deeper the dollar sinks, the death of the dollar, the higher gold prices go up. It's as simple as that, because gold is dollar based. So now with the dollar going down, it's cheaper for people to buy gold around the world. And you're seeing it, prices or buying escalating in China and with central banks. And oil prices, that is still hanging in the $83 a barrel, $82.50 for Brent crude. But with Israel ramping up the war, and they say they're going to keep doing it. They killed a couple of Iranian commanders. Could you imagine if Iran killed some IDF commanders? Oh my God, how terrible. And that's the way they feel in Iran. And they're ramping it up in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Oh, you mean the militant group? You mean the people that, the men that fought to get Israel out of Lebanon when they occupied it and killing people? Yeah, that Hezbollah. And they're ramping it up against Syria. So if war breaks out between military confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States, you're going to see oil prices, Brent crude, go to $130 plus a barrel. And that's going to kill the equity markets and the global economy.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
EVs emit more particulates, one of the most dangerous pollutants. Now, is that more overall carbon? Is that more overall pollution? I'm not 100% sure, but let's give this guy a read and let's go full screen so that you fine people can see it as well. California calls electric cars zero-emission vehicles because they don't have tailpipes. That is deceptive. Generating the electricity that powers those cars creates a particular pollution, and of course, electric cars still use tires, which are made from petroleum. Electric cars weigh far more than gasoline-powered ones, so their tires degrade faster, as electric car buyers are learning. The same analytics firm cited earlier compared two cars, a plug-in electric and a hybrid. The electric car weighed about 1/3 more than the hybrid and emitted roughly 1/4 more particulate matter because of tire wear. Total direct emissions went up, not down, when the electric car was driven. But when California's air agency analyzed the effect of its ban, it used a model that assumes both kinds of cars have the same tire wear. When the public pointed out the error, the agency doubled down, claiming it would be speculative to assume that electric cars will continue to be heavier than gasoline cars. The agency mused that in the future, automakers could probably offset the weight of heavy batteries with unspecified weight reduction in other components or the vehicle body. What's speculative is assuming that electric cars will soon weigh the same as gasoline cars they replace. Electric cars are 15 to 30% heavier because batteries store far less energy per pound than liquid fuels, while weight differences between electric and gasoline cars have remained roughly constant over the past decade. The only reasonable prediction of trends is for electric cars to get heavier as manufacturers increase battery size to boost range. All right, what do we got next? What do we got next here, producer man? The article is nearly half of all young voters won't pay more than $10 per month to fight climate change, creating potential issues for President Biden campaigning on the existential threat. Basically, what the article is saying is that people don't really buy the global warming thing, or if they do buy the global warming thing and they have to actually contribute just $10 of their own money out of pocket, they're not interested. And wouldn't that be the better way? Is just to, instead of creating legislations that secretly make your car more expensive, they secretly make your oven more expensive, they make your heating bill more expensive. They already secretly rob us through inflation all the time. But you never even see the price of, when they create that one new legislation, and now you got to buy the gas only from this company, or even look at the Russia war. Would our gasoline prices be less if we could still be buying if all that natural gas was floating? Well, according to GNFC, no, because it just gets bought up by India anyways. So you know what? We can reject that one last point. Everything else I was saying would still make sense. Think about how you probably lose more than $10 a month. I think we can all agree on that because of random government legislation. How much has oil increased in cost because Biden took unfavorable positions to the industry, and so there was less investment in, for example, even just the Keystone Pipeline. And seems to me, I guess with all of your, hey, global warming, it's coming to get all of us, we're all going to be dead in 3 months. Well, apparently not enough people are buying the story, because if you ask them to contribute just $10 a month in order to make sure that the world doesn't die from overheating, they don't care. That's the price at which they check out. Another thought on this, and, a lot of people, they'll go, well, what is Israel supposed to do? Or these people, they hate Israel, or, the people in Gaza, or after they've done all this to Gaza, how can they possibly have peace with Gaza? And I'd like to point out that I have yet to go over to Germany and try and kill Germans. I've never once thought about going over to Germany to be vengeful towards Germans. I've sat down with people who survived horrible things in the Holocaust. I've never listened to their story and went, I got to get over in there and I got to do something. And you want to know why? Because Nazis have no impact on my life. And so the fact is, I'm able to live a pretty good life right now. And so I don't look at the current Germans living in Germany and going, my God, what those people did to me, I have a blood debt. I have to get over there and I got to make sure to kill some Germans. I've never once had that thought in my entire life. You know why? Because I have no incentive to think that way. And so I'm thoroughly convinced that even in Gaza, people have moved on from hating each other for thousands of years because you just realize you've got a financial incentive to get along. And so I don't think that there needs to be endless war over there. And I think the starting point is not starving the people of Gaza, because then you can at least start moving forward towards peace. If currently the only thing that those people can do is live in an area and die because that is what you're imposing on them, then yeah, you're not leaving them with too many choices other than to hate you and try and have vengeance. But, you start rebuilding, you start actually giving people some opportunity to live a normal life. And I think at the end of the day, that's all people really want. The coverage, though, like I said, it's always interesting to me why things are actually getting covered. This is from Reuters. Is there famine in Gaza? Here's what we know. It's not quite at famine levels. The reporting was basically how close are we getting to that? And then, interestingly enough, Kamala Harris managed to get through a speech without laughing and said sensible things, basically condemning Israel and that the situation in Gaza is overly harsh. All right. Victoria Nuland, third highest ranking U.S. diplomat and critic of Russia's war in Ukraine, retiring. I got to hit up Gary Richide, our historian for the Run Your Mouth podcast, do maybe a segment called Shadow Creatures, because I think it would be great to actually take these people who have been behind the scenes the entire career and see what policy decisions these people are actually responsible for, and then tarnish their name so that when they go and they work at Columbia and they pretend like they're not absolutely moronic individuals who are just responsible for a legacy of bad decisions that led to chaos and death, maybe some kids will actually sit in the class and go, well, when you negotiated that deal and then, we fought for 3 years and then the war failed, do you feel any responsibility for the deaths and the fact that it did nothing that was in the U.S. best interest? What intelligence were you actually working on at the time when you decided that we could defeat Russia in that war? Wouldn't it be nice to actually just get all these deep state people behind the scenes, your Blinkens, your Kirbys, your this, your that, or if they never made a important policy decision or worked on an important project for their entire career, then you could just state what their career earnings were and the fact that they did nothing to actually earn all that money.
The largest government in history is so far away, so remote from the system described by people like James Madison, a government that had powers that would be few and defined, that it's like impossible to really quantify. So I think understanding how things got so bad, some of the main causes, is the first step on the road to recovery. And if you don't mind my pun, the path to liberty. So let's look at the top 5 today. And I want to start out with the word necessary. And Madison said in his opposition to the bank bill in February of 1791, he said, whatever meaning this clause may have, if they're going to debate what it means, none of them can be admitted that would give unlimited discretion to Congress. Basically, whatever Congress determines is necessary to carry out whatever it thinks is proper. Its meaning must, said Madison, according to the natural and obvious force of the terms and the context, be limited to means necessary to the end. It wasn't all caps, but he emphasized the word necessary and end, and incident to the nature of the specified powers, an incidental power. And Thomas Jefferson had a very similar take also in February of 1791, arguing against the first national bank, Alexander Hamilton's brainchild. And Jefferson said the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient. Now, Alexander Hamilton took the total opposite end of the spectrum, especially when he wanted to get a national bank going. And of course, we're still living with the pains of that today, and it's a far worse national bank than it was in 1791. And here's Hamilton. He said, necessary often means no more than needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. I mean, if you've got kids and you tell them that something is necessary for them to do, it's not a recommendation. It's not a suggestion. And that's how Hamilton is treating it here. He's telling us that necessary and proper somehow means conducive to. He's literally just making things up. He said it is a common mode of expression to say that it is necessary for a government or a person to do this or that thing when nothing more is intended or understood than that the interests of the government or person require or will be promoted by doing this or that thing. So if it's necessary to do that, that means it's just convenient. It'll help it be more effective. And that's what Jefferson and Madison and many others were arguing against in 1791 and elsewhere. Next up, I want to talk about war powers under the Constitution. James Madison described it like this in Helvidius number 4. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. So to the father of the Constitution, he's telling us that the wisest part of the Constitution is separating the power to declare war and to wage war between the between the legislative and the executive, respectively. And if the father of the Constitution tells us that's the wisest part, maybe we should pay a little attention to it. James Madison explained why this is such a problem. I've got a couple of quotes here from his political observations, April 20th, 1795. And he felt, and so many others during the founding generation felt, that war was a huge threat to liberty. And he said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War, he said, is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. We have a trifecta, massive amounts of all three. And then if you even think about how we have this kind of de facto standing army in militarized federal agencies, a lot of them wouldn't be as militarized if it wasn't for, well, the empire having to gear up and have all this gear and capabilities to station itself in 100+ countries around the world. So it's created an environment to add another standing army that the founders would have absolutely hated. So Madison warned that this was a very dangerous situation, and that is part of why he felt it was so important to separate this power of waging and declaring war between the executive and the legislature. And he points out why. He said the separation of the power of declaring war from that of conducting it is wisely contrived to exclude the danger of its being declared for the sake of its being conducted. We all understand what the founders understood, that was that the executive is the branch that is most prone to war. And so if it has the ability to make the decision on its own, like it has done for decades, without basically any input from Congress, or at best, Congress says, we authorize you to determine who, when, where, and how we're going to wage war, which is totally opposite of how they did it in the early days. And we were warned about Thomas Jefferson, of course, James Madison, warned us about turning the word necessary into something other than necessary. And of course, Alexander Hamilton did that. Unfortunately, George Washington went along with it, signed it. The Supreme Court under John Marshall reaffirmed it. And ever since, basically, government has decided whatever it considers convenient to its power is somehow necessary, even though it's only supposed to be necessary and proper. And then war powers, as Madison told us, would give us armies and debts and taxes, the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. Well, I mean, no nation, Madison said, could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare, and he called it there as well. But what helps fund all the garbage that they do, that they consider as necessary? Because if they said everything was necessary and they couldn't pay for it, or if they wanted to have all this warfare and they couldn't pay for it, well, they'd run into some problems. They'd have some natural limits. And that's why the Federal Reserve and its fiat funny money trash system that they have under the U.S. dollar, that fake money U.S. dollar, is the tool, the engine that powers the largest government in history. And I did an episode on that just this last month in February, Tyranny 101, how the Federal Reserve powers the monster state. And I encourage you to check that one out if you haven't yet, or if you just love hearing me talk about the same thing multiple times. That's a really good episode, going kind of a basic introduction into this. Now, that's not my wheelhouse, but I did my best, and I'm lucky to have some really good people doing some writing here that I'm able to work off of and learn from as I go. But fiat money, for the founding generation, that was only paper. Today, we'll have paper fiat money and the digital version eventually. And in essence, the fiat money of today, much of the inflation, and inflation is an increase in the money supply. The price increases is a result of that. Much of that inflation happening today is already digital, so we already know how much worse it can be. It's hard to get worse than trillions and trillions and trillions of debt. But anyways, here's how George Washington put it in a letter to Jabez Bowen in Rhode Island, Rhode Island was notorious for depreciating the value of a currency by printing way too much of it. And Washington put it this way: paper money has had the effect in your state that it ever will have, to ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open a door to every species of fraud and injustice.
And, Trump has his ups and downs and his personality, but if you're in politics, how can you do much criticism?
Yeah.
You might, for social reasons, say, why does he have to make all that noise? But I would always hope that, the negatives that he gets, maybe he could soften that. Now that, he's now a gentleman and he can approach it. But I'm not expecting that to happen. Matter of fact, people would say, how do you think he got there? Yeah. By being gentle?
Yeah, really.
But anyway, our goal is to try to describe and defend a position that means that we're going to have less government and more liberty. And he at least has been willing to talk to a few people on our side. He talked to my son,
that's
so
right.
that doesn't mean much has changed, but it's still something. What I think he does is, if politically it's advantageous, that's okay. But there's nothing wrong with that, because if it's politically advantageous not to be a warmonger, that's good. That's why some good will come of this. And right now, there are other limitations that I talk about all the time, and that is the frustration with war, the loss of liberty, and the financial crisis we're in helps bring some of this mess to an end.
Yeah, let's put up this first clip. This is from the Wall Street Journal. This tells you that Nikki Haley to exit Republican presidential race. There's Nikki. She's going down. She won only 2 places, D.C. and Vermont. D.C., well, that wasn't probably a big win for her. We talked about it yesterday. That would have been a great commercial if it was closer. Trump could have put an ad in. And Vermont, we'll talk about that in a second, because there's some interesting statistics out of Vermont, the Vermont win. But I think the real lesson, and maybe we're just kind of glossing this a little bit, but why not, is that she's the most hawkish candidate that we've had in a long time. She is across the board. Any problem, shoot it. That's basically her philosophy, you know. Kill it, finish it. Well, that's her philosophy. So I think the resounding rejection of Nikki Haley, now it was a number of things that didn't appeal to the American voter, but that was a big issue. She made that the center of her campaign. So I think the rejection of Nikki Haley is good news for us. It's also good news because it shows that the Romney wing of the party, the Rhino wing, the old school wing, the old reflexively neocon wing of the party, I think is on its back heels. And I think we're seeing that. We've talked about this on the show over and over. We're seeing the rise of folks who are, while not perfect, people like Vance, Green, Gates, and others. They're not perfectly anti-war. However, they're more populist. They're more attuned to, I think, the American national interest than the old guard, which is only attuned to the military-industrial complex. Now, again, we don't want to gloss it over, but overall, I think it's a good sign that this kind of populist anti-war movement in the party is on the ascendance. And as you said in your opening, Dr. Paul, if Trump is smart, he'll listen to the voters who reject Nikki and be the anti-Nikki. Oh. Yeah. A new Gallup poll came out today, and it's got pretty good news on it. Let's just, we'll just show the headline so you can see where it came from. This is Kyle Anzalone from the Libertarian Institute. Poll shows young Americans' support for Israel plummeting. Let's go to the next one and look at the tabs here. Changes in favorable ratings of Israel and the Palestinian Authority by age. Now you see among people 18 to 34 years old, the favorable views toward Israel have plummeted from 64% favorable in 23 to only 38% favorable in 2024, a 26 percentage point drop in favorableness toward Israel among young people. And I think this was probably equally encouraging. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, Dr. Paul, but asking the same question for the 18 to 34-year-olds about whether they view the Palestinian Authority favorably, that has also dropped by 4 points. Now, not as dramatic, maybe I'm misreading, but to me it almost looks like young people are saying, look, a pox on both of their houses. I'm not interested in Israel because they're dragging us into war. I'm not interested in the Palestinian Authority. I just don't care.
You know, I make fun of what goes on. I said, how do these wars start? Oh, well, it's easy. You get a bunch of teenagers out there having fun, and they say, you know, things are boring tonight. Why don't we call across this state line or, international line? We'll go and see our friends and such other. Why don't we have a little war? We could have some fun. Yeah. You know, that's the way they act, but that is not the way it works. They don't do that. It's a bunch of connivers that we talk about all the time and try to point out who's doing this real planning. And there's so many guilty parties there, and the ones that have never voted against one nickel going to militarism, they can't be helpful to the American Republic.
As you were saying that, I kind of figured out why, because look at network television, it's a mental prison. Oh, I'm a Democrat, I like to watch Rachel. Oh, I'm a Republican, I want to put on Fox News. But like you were saying, with the internet revolution, people getting their news in different ways, I think people are thinking outside the box. I think you'll have fans of Tucker Carlson watching Glenn Greenwald. You know, oh my gosh, he's on the right, he's on the left. I think they're watching, people are watching the Judge Napolitano more than ever. They're crossing over these artificial lines of left or right, R or D,
yeah,
and that's encouraging.
And it gets worse. And this comes from the concept of pure democracy. You have to get up to that 51%, not to protect your liberty, but to spend the money and control things. But you know, what we're seeing here, and the other thing that's always annoyed me is hyphenated Americans. They do. I think I've had people in my district that might be more farmers and others manufacturers, and they say, I remember once the media come out, how are you going to talk to the farmers and the manufacturers? Because you'll have to change. Why should you do that? If liberty is important, it doesn't matter. Yeah. And the real diversity is individualism. Yeah. People allowed and not curtailed in doing what they want and owning their own property and having a say about who's going to march off to fight wars that are senseless. And that's what we have to have. And this whole thing that we'll legislate some of this DEI and all this business, and all of a sudden we'll have diversity.
Yeah, right.
That's not likely to happen that way.
What I want to do now is to look at Epicurus' concept of the means by which the life of pleasure is to be achieved, because that is his distinctive contribution to hedonistic ethics. Hedonism as such, he did not originate. It actually started with a school of followers of Socrates called the Cyrenaics. We didn't mention them in this course. But the most famous early hedonist was Aristippus, who preached in effect the doctrine, eat, drink, and make merry, for tomorrow you die. And his disciples were in practice indistinguishable from the sophists. But that is certainly not Epicurus' concept of how to achieve the life of pleasure, and so he is original eminently in his idea of how to achieve the life of pleasure. He is not a Cyrenaic, gather ye rosebuds while ye may type of hedonist. Now, to understand his view of the means, I remind you of what I said earlier, the streak of malevolence and insecurity running throughout this era. It deeply affected Epicurus. In effect, he said as follows: in this kind of world, the more you care about something, the more you value it, the more passionately you desire something, the more open you are to being hurt, the more vulnerable to pain you are. If you place a premium on wealth, then of course you watch, I'm updating the examples, but the point is his, then you watch the stock market with your heart in your throat, or the latest fiscal policies of the Federal Reserve System and inflation, and etc. Whereas if your attitude is, money doesn't matter to me, you are oblivious to the ups and downs of the economy. If you care passionately about another human being, you have a romantic, deep, intense involvement, a small insult or snub, to say nothing of a betrayal, on the part of that person can wound you to the depth of your soul. On the other hand, if you are indifferent to somebody, like a stranger on the street, and he does the equivalent, you simply look at him and say, why tell it to me, and it has no effect on you at all, because you don't care. This is true of any value. If you value your appearance seriously, you look in the mirror each day and see yourself growing older. If you have a sumptuous repast and you care about it, you have a stomachache, etc. There is nothing you can count on in this world. If you want something from the world, you only open yourself to pain. To achieve true happiness, Epicurus concludes, we must value only that which is dependent on us ourselves. We have to be self-sufficient in ourselves. And only that way can we be in control and invulnerable to the thrusts of a cruel, uncertain world. What we need, therefore, above all, is independence. Not just independence from other men, but independence of reality. Every time we care about something, we give a hostage to fate, a hostage to destiny. Every time you want something from this world, you put yourself in the power of reality. It has a chance to get at you and to hurt you. Well, if you want to achieve a calm inner happiness, what then must you do? How can you become independent of what goes on in the world around you? You can't, he thought, change or improve the world. That's hopeless. What you can do is stop it from affecting you. The ordinary man lets the world stir up in him passions, feelings, desires. The wise man, he says, should see that these are really enemies, namely desires, passions. It's your passions, your emotions, which hold you to reality. It's your emotions which suck you back into the stream of events of life and which open you to being hurt. Consequently, the wise man will conquer his emotions. He will stop feeling. He will become essentially emotionless. And in that way, he will become imperturbable, invulnerable. And this is the great virtue for Epicurus, to become emotionless. You see in what way it's a variation, modification, and derivative of Plato's view, but with his own distinctively Epicurean flavor to it. Well,
So the Washington Post reported on Wednesday that the Biden administration has secretly approved more than 100 separate foreign military sales to Israel since October 7th to support the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. And we don't know how these sales are being funded. The U.S. does provide Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year, and $3.3 billion of that is what they call foreign military financing, and that is money that the U.S. gives to foreign governments to purchase American weapons. So, again, there's been over 100 sales here, and only 2 have been made public. One for $106 million in tank ammunition, and one for $147 million in components needed to make 155 millimeter artillery rounds. And these became public because the Biden administration bypassed Congress to push them through. If you remember, I covered both of those deals. And U.S. officials told the Washington Post that there was no public debate for the other 100 deals because the dollar value fell under the threshold needed to inform Congress. So it looks like they are doing a bunch of these little arms sales, so there's no oversight, so it doesn't need to be made public, so they can just do it quietly and secretly. Something I've been saying for a while is discussing how the U.S. has not been transparent at all about what they're sending Israel, about how this is being paid for, but yet they're shipping all these weapons. The Pentagon was saying at one point they were shipping weapons on a near daily basis to Israel, and this explains some of it. I think that they're doing just these little sales that they could probably do quickly just to keep it out of the public eye as Biden is coming under pressure for supporting this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And the report said that U.S. officials told Congress during a classified briefing that the hundreds of sales amounted to thousands of precision-guided munitions, small-diameter bombs, bunker busters, small arms, and other types of lethal aid, what they call lethal aid, which means aid that can kill people. So the exact number of bombs and other types of equipment that the U.S. has delivered to Israel since October 7th is not clear. The Wall Street Journal reported on December 1st that the U.S. had provided Israel with 57,000 artillery shells and 15,000 bombs, including massive bunker busters, but that figure must be much higher at this point since that was published over 3 months ago. And this revelation about these 100 arms sales that the U.S. has approved for Israel, it comes as the Biden administration claims that it's pressuring Israel to allow more aid into Gaza, where children are starving to death and a major famine is imminent if it's not happening already. But the U.S. is not using its leverage over Israel. They're not threatening to cut off military aid. They're still providing this unconditional aid. So Russian forces have been making steady gains in eastern Ukraine since taking the strategic Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month, as Ukraine's war effort continues to falter. According to Russian Defense Ministry estimates, it took Russian troops 4 months to advance 5.6 miles through Donetsk before taking Avdiivka. In the last 3 weeks, Russian forces have already advanced 3 miles west of the city, and this was expected after they took Avdiivka because it was a very key strategic city for Ukraine, the center of their war effort going back to 2014 when the Donbass war broke out. And they've been able to keep up, the Russians have been able to keep up the momentum. They're also starting to take out Abrams tanks. The U.S. made Abrams tanks. The U.S. has shipped 31 to Ukraine. Russia has said so far they've taken out 3 of those tanks. Despite the bleak situation, we know that Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are facing serious manpower and weapon shortages. It's a horrible situation for them. Ukraine's new ground forces commander, Alexander Pavlyuk, insisted that Ukrainian forces will be able to stabilize the situation and eventually go on a new counteroffensive. But we'll see. I mean, right now it's just looking really bad for the Ukrainian troops on the ground who are fighting. So on Tuesday, Texas Republican primary voters overwhelmingly supported a proposition in favor of legislation to restrict the deployment of the state's National Guard to combat zones. The proposition stated, quote, "The Texas legislature should prohibit the deployment of the Texas National Guard to a foreign conflict unless Congress first formally declares war," end quote. In response, 84% of Texas voters in this Republican primary voted yes, and only 16% voted no. I have the tweet in here from Bring Our Troops Home, which is the organization behind Defend the Guard, because that's what this proposition is based on, is the Defend the Guard legislation that if passed by a state, it would prohibit the state's National Guard from deployment to combat zones that were not without a declaration of war from Congress. And this was over 2 million people that voted in this proposition, and about 1.8 million people voted in favor of it. So this is a really good result. This is something that these guys can use to show all of these legislature, all of the state senators, state representatives, to show them, hey, you see, Republican voters want this. And I would be curious to see how this would have, for some reason, the propositions weren't on the Democratic primary either. I bet, even though this Defend the Guard Act has been overwhelmingly supported by Republican state senators and stuff, and the Democrats have mostly voted against it, I bet if you put it to Democratic voters, pose that question, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think they would probably favor this idea too. So, it's a good sign. And hopefully this gives them more ammunition to get this legislation passed in more places.
Is this the $2 billion bridge to Crimea, which looks like it's one of the wonders of the world?
Yes, I've been across it 3 times. I think it actually costs more than $2 billion, but yeah, it's a very big bridge.
But it's a civilian target. They're not talking about bombing a military base. This would be an act of war, would it not?
Well, it's going to be an act of war, whether it's a civilian target or a military target. It's an act of war. If it's a purely civilian target, it becomes an act of terrorism. One can make the argument that this bridge, because military trucks cross the bridge, military equipment on trains crosses the bridge, that it could be a military target. But you're missing the point here, because people are saying if Russia's bombing Ukraine, then Ukraine has every right to strike Russia. But they're missing the big picture. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between Russia and the collective West. Ukraine, all of its logistics, its planning, its intelligence, the training, everything takes place on European soil outside of the reach of the Russian military. And so if people want to say, well, Germany is simply empowering Ukraine to strike deep into Russia. First of all, it's not that deep. It's Crimea. It's a civilian bridge. But if you want to play that game, then what you're saying is this war has changed. Now Russia gets to strike all the targets in Europe that will level that playing field. This is very much an uneven playing field right now. Russia is actually fighting this war with a hand tied behind its back, because all of the things that it would normally be able to do to disrupt logistics, which is one of the most important aspects of the war, it can't do because all the logistics is taking place on protected soil. Poland, Germany, France, Netherlands, that's places that Russia can't touch. Ukraine has a safe haven. In the Vietnam War, we talked about, how the North Vietnamese could go back to safe havens and how this, made it very difficult for the United States to prevail in this conflict. Russia's facing a similar problem right now. And if Germany's there, if the logic is, no, you can bomb that bridge because Russia gets to bomb targets in Ukraine, you're missing the bigger picture.
Understood. Is there any question that NATO, the United States, France, Russia, Great Britain are waging war against Russia?
First of all, I would have to say that NATO isn't at this juncture. What I would say is that there are nations who are NATO members who are active participants in this conflict. And I would list Poland, I would list Great Britain, I would list France, I would list Germany, and I would list the United States at a minimum, because we have troops on the ground who are actively involved in things, whether it be targeting or logistics or command and control, that are legitimate, targets from a military perspective. So we have people on the ground in Ukraine doing things that makes them a legitimate target, but we're doing it unilaterally. We're not doing it part of a NATO collective. This is a unilateral effort. And so far, we've kept large conventional units out of the mix. That would sort of be a red line. We have advisors, however we define them, whether they be active duty or sheep dip. That's where you take an active duty person and you sign some paperwork and they become a CIA contractor, things of that nature.
Right.
We have people working air defense. We have people working the sensitive systems, HIMARS targeting, etc. We know that the British Special Air Service is there. The Special Boat Service is there. The French have sent commando units there. We have our own special forces on the ground in Ukraine. So we already have military forces deployed to Ukraine, but we haven't gone in as a NATO entity saying, here is NATO forces, a brigade, a division, a corps coming in. That would prompt a direct military conflict.
You began the conversation quite profoundly and quite accurately, I think, by saying that what the German generals were talking about is an act of war. It is no less an act of war, I would argue, for the United States to show Ukrainians how to pick a target inside Russia. It is no less an act of war for the British Special Forces to plan and plot how to blow up that bridge, and the same thing for the Poles and the French.
100%. And again, we need to understand the following. If it weren't for the intelligence support provided by the United States, Great Britain, France, and others, Ukraine wouldn't be able to accomplish any of the impressive results that they have, sinking Russian ships, damaging Russian ships, striking Russian air bases, because to take, it's not just about slapping a scalp missile or Storm Shadow under a Su-24 and going off and launching it. There's downlinks that are taking place. We're running reconnaissance missions with drones, with satellites, etc., picking up the Russian air defense radars. That creates an overlay showing the links, the gaps that can be shot. That's shot downlinked to the airplane that the Ukrainian pilot's flying, and he's able then to load this into a targeting profile for the missile that he fires with the most up-to-date stuff that allows that missile to work its way through. This is why they're succeeding. If the Ukrainians didn't have this, they wouldn't have any of these successes. So it is an act of war. We are active participants in the processes that allow the Ukrainians to strike Russian targets.
And no general government legislative body in any of these countries, United States, France, Germany, Great Britain, I don't know about Poland, but I'm going to ask you, has authorized those countries to deploy military assets against Russia?
Well, what I would say is that no legislative body has done it overtly. I know that the United States, for instance, we have presidential findings. So the president can sign a finding authorizing certain things to take place. You report these to the Gang of Eight, which are, the 8 most powerful members of the
That's the Congress Senate. Within the Congress that meets in secret and can't repeat to other members of Congress what they're told.
Right. So that's not really democracy taking place. The Prime Minister has the ability to do things with the Special Air Service that avoids parliamentary scrutiny. And I believe the French have similar things. So what we're seeing here is these nations that are ostensible, democracies are using mechanisms within their system which are undemocratic in principle and reality, and use it to bypass the kind of scrutiny that normally would take place before you send a nation to war. And I just want to remind people, if Germany ever did facilitate the use of Taurus missiles to take down the Kerch Bridge, that's an act of war that Russia would retaliate. That retaliation would more than likely lead to a direct conflict between NATO and the United States, which would lead to a general nuclear war, and then we all die. That's the stakes here. This isn't a game. We've allowed Germany and France, the Germans with their Taurus missile, France talking about sending troops over to hijack the national security of the United States. We are on a path towards a war that will be global ending, and we don't have Congress talking about it. We don't have the president being honest with the American people. We're pretending that it isn't happening, but it is happening.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
To state 2 other variables at the $10, $20, $40, $50,000 a year, forget buying a house. Just going on dates can feel very intimidating when you realize, this is not a pathway to marriage because I couldn't possibly afford that.
Yeah.
And downhill from all of these decisions, in my opinion, is the fact that when you have inflation and you can't easily save money and see it, continue to grow, people do make more compulsive decisions. And so they do end up living with multiple roommates, buying the avocado toast, buying expensive coffee, taking vacations for Instagram pictures, and having pricey gym memberships because all of the other things, like just saving up to go buy a house, it doesn't seem that easy to do. Because what do? You got to figure out where to be in the stock market. You got to figure out the taxes on CDs. You got to try, you know what I mean? The amount of things you have to try and figure out just to preserve your wealth to feel like there's something worth investing for, especially as a young kid without that much knowledge. Think about it. If you're coming out of college and you're not financially savvy and you're working a construction job and you're actually making good money. Let's say you're making $25, $30 an hour. Like you've actually, you've got a skilled job and you're making money. Think about what you have to do to try and be slick about actually saving that money to potentially go and buy a house.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then think about if you're not savvy like that, but you are you're working hard and you're making something, whatever it is. Yeah, say $30 an hour or something like that, or $40 an hour, and you're working hard. And then the price of everything shoots up the way it has in the last 4 years. And that buries you. And so why is it? And look, for someone like Bill Maher, who's been, I don't know, a millionaire since the 90s, to just go, oh no, it's these kids, they've got it better than ever. It's I don't think you have any idea. I don't think you have any idea what it is actually like for people out there today. And it's just not, you know what I mean? It's just not, that's not right. And you're right about that it does, all of the stuff that we talk about all the time, all of the kind of government interventions, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the income tax or just the rest of it, it does really disincentivize people from doing the right things. It makes it much harder. And anyway, I just thought it's a crazy conversation. It's another one like we played before where Bill Maher's in this moment where he's trying to argue these kind of liberal progressive values against someone who's just responding with common sense. They're just going, the other one was just have you bought eggs recently? And he's like, what about the price of a house? I mean, by the way, that's not even, when I said the average price of a house, it's no, now go make that in a city. It's insane.
Also, another variable, I'm going to just call it government chaos, which is I graduated from college during the, I think I must have graduated in 08, 09, heart of the financial, the last recession. And what I could tell you is I was not a particularly good student, but in other climates when companies are just hiring and looking for bodies, I'm sure I would have just had some dumb job at some financial firm or something. My career, and it's in part because of my decision to pursue stand-up comedy, but between the ages of 24 and moving back home and then not having those first jobs out of college, I probably didn't have my first office job until I was age 30 when the economy was kind of hot again and they're just putting, bodies in. Now look at a decade later from what I went through in 08, kids are graduating college during COVID. And you're not really getting hired in the same capacity because you're doing a work from home job. You're not getting job training in the same way. So what I'm trying to point out is that the government chaos in the system and the way that we kind of have centralized government now will, and also even just factor in, your student loans because of the money that government has made available to colleges to increase those costs. What I'm trying to say is all of these are government variables that will hinder your ability to feel like you're on a path of growth early in your career to make decisions like, oh, I want to be getting married at age 25, 26, or I want to be forward looking and saving and building my career.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And that's a big deal. And then it's how do you put a price on that exactly? How exactly do you say to some young person that it's yes, you've been put in a situation where you can't be put on a path, and forget even getting married and having a family. Cause I know I understand that I am to some degree injecting my subjective values into that equation, but how about just being put on a path to being independent? Because I think that's something that people that really is an integral part of what it is to be a man. And that's something that's robbed from so many people. And it's not because of anything they did wrong. It's because of the system that they inherit. And to have, it's so funny, man, because there is something where I do have this level of contempt for the baby boomer generation that Bill Maher is a part of. And I don't get me wrong, I'm not being a collectivist about this. There's lots of baby boomers who I love. I love my mother, and I love my in-laws, and I love a lot of baby boomers. But there's something that it's so easy for people of that age, people in their 60s or whatever, to just go oh, you guys, you know what I mean? Oh, you take it so for granted. Look at all the toys that you have that we didn't have, and you're going to complain about what we did. And it's hey, look, you guys, at least through the policies of the politicians that you voted for, created a situation where it's impossible for your children's generation to own anything. And then you look at them like they're the brats or something like that. I just find that so awful.
Just to speak to two examples of that, because they wrote the greatest wealth expansion in human history, but there's two variables at play there. One is, you know, like a teacher who was working, let's say 70 years ago in the New York City police, any New York City job for that matter, they're like that first tier of pensions. So yeah, you guys are the beneficiaries of the Ponzi scheme you created because you're the first generation of people who got the best retirement benefits. That changes your entire life planning. Or I know my grandfather, for example, said that he had a couple real estate investments that if it wasn't for inflation, he would have lost a lot of money, but he was basically bailed out by inflation. So that's another one. How many of you guys literally rode the wave of the money that you guys facilitated the printing of, that you owned assets that went up in value, that changed the retirement and the ability of the lives that you guys lived for all of us to basically inherit that inflation?
The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, so I want to talk about the Powell's semi-annual testimony today at the House. And, you know, before he delivered his prepared remarks and took questions from the congressman, a couple of them spoke. You know, the chairman of the committee, the ranking minority member, and that's Maxine Waters. And I want to point out something that she said, because in her little talk, she brought up housing. And she said that housing is a main driver of inflation, that rising housing costs are the reason for inflation, a main driver. And, of course, that's not true. Housing isn't driving anything. Housing's just going along for the ride. The driver is Maxine Waters, right, and her buddies in Congress. They're driving the inflation bus, not housing. Housing's just riding in the bus along with everything else. The driver of inflation is deficit spending and then the money that the Federal Reserve prints to monetize that debt. That is what drives inflation. Everything else is just dragged along. So Maxine Waters has got it wrong. Instead of chastising Powell because somehow he's not paying attention to housing as if, you know, there's something he could do, she should be looking in the mirror. She's the reason that the price of housing and rents and everything else are going up. But also, to make matters worse, there's a lot of regulations coming out of government, and not all of it from the federal government, a lot of it from state and local governments, that unnecessarily makes housing more expensive. You know, whether it's making rents higher than they should be, or maintenance costs, or taxes, or insurance. But a lot of stuff costs more because government regulation is interfering in the market. So the reason that people are struggling with housing prices is government-created inflation and government regulation. And a lot of it is coming from the House, where Maxine Waters has been a member for I don't know how long, but for quite some time. But anyway, so when Powell speaks, he again talks about how good the economy is. The economy is great. The labor market is strong. We've avoided recession. And in fact, all the Democrats, of course, use their time as an opportunity to talk about how great the economy is and give the credit to Biden and Powell. But then the Republicans come in and they try to point out that the economy isn't good and we have a lot of inflation, and they blame that on Biden. But they overlook the fact that when Trump was in charge, they were running deficit spending too. A lot of the COVID, all the COVID stimulus started with Trump. You know, it's just that when Biden came into town, he expanded on what Trump had already done. But it's not like the Republicans have clean hands here. And so it makes their criticism, disingenuous. And, some people might accept it, but for other people, it's harder. That's why I like being consistent. So I have credibility when I say something. I'm not just being a political opportunist and just trying to blame the other side of the aisle. I look at both sides as complicit, even though clearly, what Biden is doing now is even worse. But, there's a lot of optimism that, if Trump goes back to office, the inflation problem is going to go away. Well, nothing that Trump is talking about doing is going to solve the problem. And if he presides over a second term the way he presided over the first term, it's just going to get a lot worse because it's just more deficit spending. Right? That's what he did before. Maybe he'll change. We'll see. But what Powell was saying about inflation at the beginning was incorrect, because he is claiming that inflation is pretty much down, and he just wants to make sure it stays down. Even if Powell was right about inflation coming down, which he's not. If it did come down and then we substantially reduced rates, it would go right back up again. And that is what gold is telling you. If gold is telling you that rates are too low, how do you lower them in the face of that? Those are the mistakes that were made in the 1970s before Paul Volcker came into office and finally did the right thing. We're still doing the wrong thing under Powell. And what he is indicating he's going to do is extremely dangerous. And now the dollar was down, a decent amount today, I think 0.5%. Still, well north of 100, around 103. But the dollar, again, to me, looks like it's rolling over. Because where are the central banks getting all the money to buy this gold? It's dollars. They're using their dollars to pay for the gold. I mean, the whole purpose of buying gold is to get out of dollars. That's what they want to do. But you can't get out of dollars without getting into something else. And so why get into euros? Why get into yen? Why take that chance? Buy gold. That's your safest bet. That's the only monetary asset that's not somebody else's liability. That's the only asset that you can't get sanctioned. As long as you have the gold, in your own custody, right? You're not leaving it at the Fed or something. You take delivery of the gold. You keep it within your own sovereign territory. I mean, no one can take it unless they physically invade you, right, and take your gold, right? And so this is what people are trying to do, and the Fed is completely ignoring it. Credit card debt is at a record high. Household debt is a record high. Government spending a record high. The rate hikes have done nothing. Too little, too late. The Fed has not bent the inflation curve at all. It doesn't matter that the numbers have come down from 9 to 3. It's not because of those rate hikes. And the numbers are going to go up. The only way the rate hikes affected the inflation rate is that the anticipation of rate hikes brought down commodity prices. But they're going back up. Oil got back almost to $80 again today, 79 and change. Look at the stock market, too. I mean, one of the ways that higher rates has typically brought down inflation was a reverse wealth effect. Higher rates bring down stock prices. They bring down housing prices. That doesn't happen. Housing prices are record highs. Stock prices are record highs. And the Fed is done hiking. I mean, normally, when the Fed is finished hiking, asset prices have come down, right? They start to go up when the Fed starts to cut. But they never went down when the Fed hiked. So how are you going to ignite an even bigger asset bubble by cutting rates when prices never even went down? So the rate hikes have done nothing to put that inflation genie back in the bottle.
I'll have to describe our philosophy. We're for less government, not more government.
That's right. That's right.
We're for sounder money, not more fiat.
That's right.
Less debt. A lot of things, but they don't even hardly talking about that.
Yeah.
They just go on and on. Their technicalities go. So we'll have to talk about some of the technicalities in foreign policy. This one we've touched on this one, Yemen and that problem over there.
Yeah.
But this headline on the Cradle says the Pentagon blames the intel gap for failure to stop Yemen's Red Sea operation. Does that mean the Pentagon's confessing? I don't think they do that very often. But at times, there's somebody comes along and admits, most of the time it's a justification to get more of the same stuff and change it around. But anyway, the failure started the day we went in there, and we've been in there more than one day or 1 year. We've been messing around there for years, and it was bound to happen. And we had to deal with the Saudis and work all that out, and the whole mess over there. So everybody should surprised. Why do we have so much trouble? Oh, it's the Pentagon. They slipped up. There was one guy. We'll put him in jail, whoever messed up on the intelligence. But I would say the whole principle is not intelligent, and that the activity they're doing is not intelligent. And when you get into who does what and why, you find out that some people are praised for doing the same thing and they get promoted, and other people go to prison, under these circumstances. So this is a shame. But the Pentagon has to explain themselves. How did they mess up? How did they misjudge this? And what are they going to do about it? That is the spot. I'm not very optimistic that we're going to have a great answer by tomorrow morning, and we're going to move the troops out like we should.
Well, it's Operation Prosperity Guardian. We can put up this link. It's from the Cradle is the article. It's a good publication, definitely worth looking at. As you say, Dr. Paul, Pentagon blames intel gap for failure to stop Yemen's Red Sea operations. And just to backtrack a little bit, we had October 7th, the Hamas attack, and then we had Israel's counterattack, and then all of a sudden we see that Israel is not just going after Hamas, Israel is basically flattening Gaza and killing 30,000 Palestinians. Well, Yemen didn't like that. The people in Yemen didn't like that. The leadership didn't like that. And so they said, okay, the Red Sea is closed to shipping going to and from Israel. We're going to close down the ports. This is a way that we are going to do what we think is right to protect people who are suffering a humanitarian catastrophe. which is pretty objectively the case. And so this is an example of the U.S. reaction. Oh yeah, well, we're going to start bombing you, which is exactly what the Biden administration did. They didn't go and ask them, okay, do we have a plan? Do we know everything we need to know? No, it just bombs away. And so what you have, and actually it's even worse than you're saying, Dr. Paul, because the Pentagon guy came before Congress and said, don't blame us, it was the CIA. They didn't give us any intelligence. We thought everything was going to be fine. And put up this next clip, this will tell you what they were saying. They said U.S. defense officials have blamed insufficient intelligence for Washington's abortive airstrike campaign against Yemen, which started mid-January and has so far failed to deter the Yemeni armed forces from attacking U.S., UK, and Israel-linked vessels in the Red Sea in support of Palestine. So initially it was only just about Israel-linked vessels, but then the U.S. and UK started bombing Yemen. They said, okay, we're gonna mess with your vessels too. But it turns out, by starting this bombing, this is just an example of this sort of war should be the last resort, but with the U.S. government, it's always a first resort. So they started bombing, it's not working at all, and now they're saying, well, we just didn't know that much about him.
And then they open the door for questions. Did he do it on purpose? What serves their interest? Well, building more bombs, and showing how dangerous the world is. But the one result of this is something that is very predictable, and this is the Yemeni leaders maintain that no amount of hostilities will deter us from continuing their Red Sea expeditions.
Yeah, the Ukraine war and the Western system's fatal flaw. It's a very interesting article pointing out why the Ukraine, it talked about Ukraine's imminent capitulation to Russia. Ukraine will not win, Russia will win, and it's because of a fatal flaw in the system of how we approach the military and how we approach defense and paying for it in the U.S. and in the West in general.
Well, what caught my attention, and this is just a assessment by me. I can't prove anything, but we talked about Marco Rubio yesterday, and he had a different appeal. He really didn't think we could win the war from the beginning. I didn't understand his excuse for it, but it was insane. So that was the case. So I thought, well, there's two things there. Yesterday we talked about Rubio sort of throwing in the towel, and then we have these people come on and getting articles like this. And this is I think enlightening, but it doesn't enlighten the right people. It just builds more determination on their part because, what we see is stupidity and why did they do that? And there's plenty of that to go around. But there's also, people that that's their policy and they hope they can get away with it, and they do get away with it, and they get their support from the media. And eventually, though, why in recent months now, I've become more optimistic because I think the alternative now, to the mainstream media has improved tremendously. It's still a mess. We've complained a lot about the social media and working with the government, but there's some social media that's not interested in working with the government. So and I think the technology is out there to try to wake people up to this, and that's when they're going to panic. Matter of fact, I think there's some of that panic going on right now because the opposition to the principles we stand for getting louder and louder.
Yes. Brian Berlev talks about many of the reasons why the combined West is now clearly losing the arms race, not only against Russia but also against China, is that while Russia's defense industry is purpose-driven, that of the West is profit-driven. And we know this because we see the revolving door between military officers and cushy jobs in the military-industrial complex. You double dip, you're a general, you get out, you get your massive pension, plus you make $500,000 or probably more a year working for Lockheed Martin, what have you. The whole system is corrupt because then you argue for more war. So war is a sort of self-perpetuating machine rather than how many missiles do we need to deter our enemies.
There's a market effect here because people are being rewarded for doing bad, building weapons and gouging the taxpayer. But they're very blunt about it. It says Western military-industrial complex is entirely structured around profit, like you say, profit objectives, which created a perverse system of incentives that rendered its output ineffective in more than one way or another. So it's not even accomplishing it. Matter of fact, they claim this is making us safe and we're bringing about peace. The truth is, all this mischief is making us poorer and more vulnerable and less free. And people don't want to listen to that.
No. But
I want to correct that. There are a lot of people who do, but our numbers just aren't big enough yet.
But it's just like our friend Chuck Spinney said, and I know that he's spoken at one of your lunches. I've known him for 25 years or so. He spent an entire career at the Pentagon saying just that. We spend a ton of money for stuff that doesn't work because the system is broken. And he got on the cover, I think, of Newsweek for doing it in the 80s, but it didn't fix the system. So here we are. I do want to say one last quote from the article because I really like this. I'm sure other people have read it. It's nothing new. But it's a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. Maybe you saw this. If you can put that last one up. He says, as Napoleon Bonaparte put it, wars happen when your government tells you who the enemy is. Revolutions happen when you figure it out for yourself. So I thought that was kind of a clever statement.
Well, how should you live then once this happens? Well, you obviously wouldn't expect to live a life of achievement, creation, action, of going out in the world and fighting for your values, but just the opposite. A life of withdrawal from the world, a retirement from the cares of life, of indifference to the spectacle of daily affairs. You want to capture it in an aphorism? The essence of Epicurus' philosophy on this point is nothing ventured, nothing lost. Or better be safe than sorry. Wall yourself in from reality, and then it can't hurt you. And it's very appropriate, therefore, that Epicurus had himself built a sheltered garden with, I gather, good solid walls. And it's always referred to as the sheltered garden of Epicurus. And he proceeded to retire into the garden, live ascetically, that is to say, for a Greek, of course. Eat a simple diet with a few chosen friends, hold quiet philosophic discourses, and let the world outside the garden go to hell. Hence, the greatest happiness is absence of strong emotions and cessation of action. Notice, therefore, that happiness is something negative for Epicurus. It is the state of not being hurt. Pleasure for him is absence of pain in the body and worry in the mind. So-called positive pleasure, the actual positive experience of pleasure, depends on positive desires, and that, of course, leaves you vulnerable and anxious. The model of happiness should be, we might say, dreamless sleep. Epicurus himself chose the example of having a good digestion. Being rather dyspeptic himself, he thought there were only two states with regard to digestion, and he's right, there are. Either your digestion is kicking up and causing you trouble, or it's acting well, in which case you don't notice it. Nobody has a positive thrill inside. And of those two states, of course, he identified happiness with the absence of trouble. And apparently that was one of the factors contributing to this theory. So it is a complete mistake, historically, for modern restaurants to call themselves Epicurean and the term epicure and so on. As one professor of mine put it, Epicurus' motto was not at all eat, drink, and make merry, for tomorrow you die. This is completely false. His motto, if anything, was neither eat, drink, nor make merry, lest tomorrow you diet. You get the idea. Emotionlessness will make you independent of reality, self-sufficient, invulnerable, and therefore you won't feel pain, fear, and worry, and that is happiness. Now, this is the essence of Epicurus' view. He mitigated it somewhat, because he allowed some positive pleasures, if they are not too violent, don't stir you up, excite you, and bind you to the world again. He himself emphasized intellectual pleasures and the pleasures of friendship as superior to physical pleasures, because the former he thought were less violent and more in your own control. He advocated a simple life of philosophic converse in the garden with a few chosen friends, about whom presumably you do not care too passionately, so that if one of them gets sick and dies, you take it with a philosophic shrug. He said at one point that there were three kinds of desires. One, natural and necessary, and that includes food, drink, and shelter in the appropriately modest forms. Two, natural but unnecessary, and that includes sex and fame. And third, unnatural and unnecessary, and that is essentially the desire for luxury. You simply live a frugal, simple life. As far as sex, here is a quote from Epicurus, quote, "Sexual intercourse has never done a man good, and he is lucky if it has not harmed him," unquote. You see, sex is a very violent emotion, and even at best, if you could tame it, it's a distraction from more tranquil pursuits. Lucretius, by the way, agrees that sexual love is to be avoided, but he says that it's all right to engage in sexual intercourse so long as it's devoid of passion. I leave this to you to project. Now notice, therefore, that we see the process of man turning away from life on earth already begun at this early stage. Here we have a philosophy which is materialistic, essentially atheistic, hedonistic. Now on the face of it, that is as non-religious as a philosophy can be. And yet, what it boils down to in its practical recommendations is withdraw, give up, retire from life, don't let yourself be hurt. Now Epicurus really merely represents the start of this process of withdrawal. He is not yet by any means consistent. He still wants all kinds of things from life. Pleasure, for instance, even if of a negative sort. He wants his garden. He wants his few friends. He wants his good digestion, etc. Now, by his own reasoning, if he were fully consistent, he should abandon all of these also, because any one of them could open him up to pain. As, for instance, if a friend goes bad, or his garden wall comes crumbling down, or is taxed by the city administration, etc. The possibility of pain, in a word, is inherent in pursuing any values. In other words, the possibility is inherent in life as such. If you want to avoid it absolutely, there's only one sure way to do it, and that is death. Dead men, as the saying goes, feel no pain. Now, this conclusion Epicurus did not draw. He is the beginning of an era, not yet the end of it. As you will see, however, The next school is much more consistent on this point, although still not yet fully. And let us now turn to the next school this evening, the Stoics.
I just watched the State of the Union, basically recording this right after watching. And there wasn't too much foreign policy. He started on Ukraine. He said a bunch of nonsense about that. The biggest thing was his claim that Putin's not going to stop in Ukraine. He's going to keep going into Europe, which is just total nonsense. And he said, pass the aid. And so earlier in the day on Thursday, it came out that Biden was going to announce this U.S. military mission to establish a temporary pier in Gaza to get more aid into the Strip. And this is as Palestinians are starving to death and Israel is still restricting aid. And this measure is being ordered instead of Biden using the enormous leverage that he has over Israel to pressure them to allow in more aid or just halt this genocidal campaign altogether. But he's not doing that. They're going to do this pier project, and they also started these airdrops of aid, which is really, just a PR ploy to make it look like the U.S. is doing something while they're the ones providing the bombs and all the support to the military that's starving these people to death. So Biden said at the State of the Union, quote, "Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the Gaza coast that can receive large ships carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters," end quote. U.S. officials told Axios earlier in the day that the pier in the sea off the Gaza coast will allow hundreds of aid trucks to enter the Strip per day, but the pier will take weeks to build. It's not clear how long exactly, but at least a few weeks, and Palestinians are already starving to death at a rapid rate. Biden insisted that there would be no U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza as a result of this operation, but of course, the plan does run the risk of U.S. personnel being targeted off the coast of Gaza, which of course, if that happens, I mean, who knows what would happen next, the escalation that would be next after that. So the aid will pass through Cyprus before heading to the pier and will be subject to Israeli inspections, which means some could be turned away. So CNN reported the other day that just examples of items that Israel is turning away, is rejecting from allowing into the Gaza Strip. And that includes anesthetics and anesthesia machines, oxygen cylinders, ventilators, and water filtration systems. The report said that other items that have faced restrictions include dates, sleeping bags, medicines to treat cancer, water purification tablets, and maternity kits. So these are the types of things that Israel is restricting. So if Israel has the ability to turn these shipments away, I mean, what's going to stop them? The Ukrainian president is going to appoint General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief, as the ambassador to the UK. So Zelensky removed Zaluzhny from his post as a top general on February 8th, and the two have been at odds over the disastrous war with Russia for years. Zaluzhny has long been rumored to be a potential candidate once Ukraine has presidential elections again, and Zelensky's move to send him to the UK is seen as an effort to keep him from domestic politics. So Ukraine's foreign ministry announced this on Thursday, and then Zelensky said that Zaluzhny told him that he wants to go the diplomacy route after being the commander-in-chief. So he's saying, they've been acting cordial publicly since Zelensky removed him. It wasn't clear exactly how Zaluzhny was going to respond. But this news actually came after there was a poll in Ukraine released that found Zelensky would lose to Zaluzhny in a presidential election, lose pretty badly. The poll found that 41% would vote for 41% would vote for Zaluzhny in a first-round election, while only 23.7% would vote for Zelensky. So he's a real political threat. And Ukraine was due to hold presidential elections on March 31st of this month, but they have been delayed as Zelensky continues to extend martial law. Under Ukraine's constitution, a vote cannot be held in Ukraine under martial law, but Zelensky previously said it was possible if Western countries paid him enough money, but he's since dropped that idea. So while the idea that the Biden administration, all the Russia hawks in the U.S. are selling this proxy war as a fight for democracy, the U.S. has not pushed Zelensky to hold elections, and parliamentary elections that were scheduled for last fall have also been delayed. Sweden officially joined NATO on Thursday, becoming the 32nd member of the Cold War era alliance, which had 16 members when the Soviet Union dissolved. By joining NATO, Sweden has officially abandoned its centuries-old policy of neutrality that kept the country out of 2 world wars, sparing it the destruction that most European nations faced. Sweden's Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and Secretary of State Antony Blinken made Stockholm's membership official in Washington. Kristersson was also due to visit the White House, and he attended Biden's State of the Union as a guest of honor. So Blinken said, quote, "This is a historic moment for Sweden. It's historic for the alliance. It's historic for the transatlantic relationship. Our NATO alliance is now stronger, larger than it has ever been," end quote. So the U.S. and Sweden, they've already signed a new military agreement that gives the U.S. access to multiple bases in Sweden. The U.S. signed a similar deal with Finland, which became NATO's 31st member last year. And Finland shares an over 800-mile border with Russia. And of course, Russia is beefing up its military in Western Russia in response to this. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Wednesday, quote, "Against the background of a buildup of NATO's military potential near the Russian borders, the expansion of the alliance through the accession of Finland and in the future Sweden, we have taken steps to strengthen the groupings of troops in the northwestern and western strategic directions," end quote. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. and its allies told the Russians that NATO would not be expanded east of Germany and that they could therefore not offer NATO membership to Poland and the other countries to the east. So this was not put in any treaty, and the U.S. and its NATO allies broke this promise made in these conversations and expanded and made an enemy out of post-Soviet Russia when they didn't have to. And of course, all of this was a huge factor in Putin's decision to invade the NATO promise for Ukraine and all that.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
China splurges on gold for a 16th month. This is from Bloomberg. As prices hit records. Oh, yeah. Let's see. Gold today is $2,160 per ounce. No surprise to Trends Journal subscribers. Here's one of your top trends for 2024. You got it. Golden days. A golden year for gold. It's just the beginning. Oh, and you know why gold prices are going up? Because everything is so nice in the world, and it's a safe haven asset, and everybody feels so safe and secure with the Israel war expanding and the Ukraine war. Keep trying to heat that up. But the big bottom line is what we said, and now they're saying it. The Fed's going to lower interest rates this year in the run up to the presidential reality show. And that's all it is. It's a shit show. I like Trump. I like Biden. Fuck off. I don't like any of them. Do what you want to do. I don't tell you what to do. Don't tell me what to do. And hate me because I don't swallow your shit. Okay? So they want to keep Ms. Fatsabrut there, Janet Yellen, the former Fed head, as Treasury Secretary. So they're going to do everything they can because the Feds are running the government. Got it? There is real concern among a lot of people in a lot of nations. And by the way, you're also seeing other countries as well, according to the World Gold Council. Central banks bought 1,037 tons of gold last year, just shy of the all-time high of 2022, and it's going to a new high this year. There's a strong case for record buying by countries including China, Poland, and others. It goes on to say, and there are a number of central banks buying combined total of 1,000 tons a year. They know how bad things are going to get. So again, we don't tell you what to do. We give you our trends analysis and our trend forecasts, and you know the deal. Think for yourself. This is really hardly reported in the media today. You go to CNBC, it's nothing anywhere that's coming up much. U.S. trade deficit widened in January, but more than forecast. Yep, it's up 5.1%. So we're buying more, selling less. Everything is perfect. The markets are going up. It's great. Moving on. Nordstrom shares fall 10%. And what else do we have here? Victoria's Secret falls most ever. No, only down 28%. Foot Locker, they only lost 30%. Who else do we have over here? Hugo Boss isn't a boss anymore. Their stocks plunged 13% on pessimistic sales outlook. Again, we've been writing in the Trends Journal week after week about what's going on over here. And again, they're only reporting the highlights and not much of the lowlights. And it's going to go low because, you ready? Layoffs rise at the fastest rate for February since 2009. So this is Challenger Gray and Christmas. 2009, you mean the height of the Great Recession, or as we called it, the Panic of 08. And I took that domain name out in 2007 and called it. Yep. A total of nearly 85,000 planned cuts showed an increase of 3% from January and 9% from the same month a year ago. Challenger experts say companies often cite restructuring plans. Yeah. That's bullshit. Oh, Pentagon claims economic bonanza for arming Ukraine. Isn't that great? The Ukraine conflict, and they go on to say that Austin, this Lloyd Austin, who formerly killed people in Iraq and in Afghanistan when he was in the United States military, General Austin. These investments have expanded, facilitated, and created jobs for American workers. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Sending our arms to go killing people and bragging that it's creating jobs. Again, in total disgust of 5-star General, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned that the military-industrial complex is robbing the nation of the genius of the scientists, sweat of the laborers, and the future of the children. And ramping up the war, several were reported dead in an explosion at Iranian refinery. This just happened. They blew up gas pipelines a couple of weeks ago. Israel's ramping this war up. Of course, we don't know who did it yet, but we'll find out, of course. IDF carries out airstrikes against Hezbollah. Keeps ramping up. National Guard to be deployed in New York City subway in crime crackdown. Isn't that nice? Spending some $21 million to do it. You can check your bags. And that's going to be fun to go on the subway, night in Calcutta. Not one word in this article by ABC News that none of this existed before the COVID war. None of it. Crime was not where it is now. When people lose everything I said and have nothing left to lose, they lose it. And we're losing it big time.
The corporate media lied too much, and it killed them.
Biden quickly explained that actually his top priority has nothing to do with America. His top priority is sending billions more to Ukraine. A foreign war in Eastern Europe, a war across the world that has nothing to do with the United States, that the United States is not obligated by any treaty to join. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. A war that can only hurt this country and already has hurt it in grave and permanent ways. The invasion of Ukraine is the most important thing to Joe Biden. Not ending the invasion of our own country by drug cartels, which control huge swaths of the southern United States at this point. Not our degrading economy that you experience every day. Not our collapsing schools where kids can't read at all. Not the 100,000 fentanyl deaths every year. Not the declining life expectancy that is obvious if you look around. Collapsing public health, an epidemic of suicide and murder, things that hurt Americans. Ghost armies of drug addicts living on the streets. Right outside the chamber where the speech was given tonight. None of that matters. Biden's top priority is aid for Ukraine. It was deranged. You watch this, you thought, this is insane. Does anyone in the room think it's insane? They must. Here's how the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson of Louisiana, newly elected, the man who leads Republicans, in fact, the top elected Republican in the United States of America, here's how he responded as Joe Biden told the country that the invasion of Ukraine is his top priority. Watch this.
Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. But Ukraine can stop Putin. Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. My message to President Putin, who I've known for a long time, is simple. We will not walk away. We will not bow down. I will not bow down.
This is crazy talk. There's no explanation of what the goal is here. There's lie after lie. Ukraine can stop Russia. No, it can't. This has gone on for over 2 years. NATO is stronger than ever. No, it's not. NATO is on its way to collapse, as is the economy of Western Europe. For not one sentence did Joe Biden explain what the goal of this exercise is, when we'll know we've won, and what the future should look like. Again, it was crazy talk. And yet, Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, nodded gravely. Oh, of course, he is completely on board with Joe Biden on this Biden's signature issue. And that's not a guess. As of this afternoon, Mike Johnson is secretly supporting Biden's agenda, sending another $60 billion to the oligarchs in Ukraine. Johnson plans to let Democrats onto the floor of the House to vote for this. This is a stealthy procedural move designed to shield him and other Republicans from criticism. Oh, the Democrats did it. But that's exactly what it is. He's the Speaker of the House. He could stop it, but he won't, because he's on board. So why is he on board? Is Mike Johnson representing his own voters as he backs Joe Biden's signature agenda item, a war against Russia? No, he's not. Republican voters in Louisiana are not for this. Republican voters nationally are not for this. They hate this. It has nothing to do with them. And it's insulting. As their country is invaded, we send billions to prevent the invasion of another country that we have nothing to do with? But the Uniparty demands this, so Mike Johnson is doing it. And so at some point you ask, well, why are they demanding this, actually? Why is war with Russia the most important thing? Could it be because they're getting rich from war? Well, that's certainly true. And there may be other reasons as well. We could guess. But we don't need to, because we know that it's happening, and we know that war against Russia is not the only war we're going to be engaged in, and not the only one that Biden announced tonight. Biden also told the country that we're going to have boots on the ground in Gaza. Really? Or admitted it, in fact. American forces have actually been there for months. Did you know that? Did anyone ask you? Has anyone explained to you, no matter where your sympathies lie, what the point of this is, when we'll know we've won? What's the objective here? American lives will be at risk. But of course, no one's told you. And of course, you already know the point. The point is to suck the United States into another foreign war that can't possibly help the United States, a war that can only hurt us and already is hurting us. And we're doing this not because it helps us, but because foreign interests are demanding that we do it. America is being used, as we so often have been. And the result of all of this is that the world is now closer to nuclear war at this moment than at any time in history, closer than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have no idea where this is going. You never do once people start to die, once wars begin. No PowerPoint can tell you, no speech to a joint session can tell you where this is going. It's dynamic. It's completely unpredictable. And that's why wise people pause before accelerating. But there are no wise people in charge in either party, on either side. Do you think Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has any clue what will happen in a war with Russia? Of course not. You can't say where this is going. This is so reckless that it qualifies as suicidal. And maybe they are. But the rest of us aren't. But the most interesting fact of the speech was the emphasis. There was not a meaningful word for the entire duration about the things that actually matter to people who live here, like crime or inflation or fentanyl or the foreign army now occupying our country. Joe Biden doesn't care. There was no upside for you in any of the things that he said.
Right, on January 8th, 1790, less than a year into his first term, George Washington stood in front of a joint session of Congress in New York City and delivered what would be the first message to the United States Congress on the State of the Union. They didn't call it the State of the Union address then. They called it the first annual message to Congress, but this was the precursor to what we have today. And here he kicks it off. This is the first sentence. He said, "I embrace with great satisfaction the opportunity which now presents itself of congratulating you on the present favorable prospects of our public affairs." So he's like, we've gone through quite a bit, and now we have a favorable situation. We can move forward. And in the first session of Congress, we did some good stuff. But here he's going to follow up with some priorities that he's asking them to move on. He said the recent accession. So the first thing he gets to, the recent accession of the important state of North Carolina to the Constitution of the United States, of which official information has been received. So he's celebrating the fact that North Carolina decided to join the Union. And Dave Benner has an interesting short blog post on this. But Dave points out that during this time, the United States did not attempt to use coercion against the state of North Carolina. They did not view their status as an independent republic as a rebellion or raise an army to force its approval. Instead, Dave writes, peace and mutual friendship characterized the dealings between North Carolina and the United States. And it's very likely, at least my reading of this, Dave probably knows the history a little bit better than I do. But my reading of it, it was because of this peaceful relationship that encouraged North Carolina to get on board. And George Washington celebrated that right off the bat. So then Washington then goes on to outline his priorities. And the first thing that he talks about is national defense, but not in the way that anyone in modern times talks about it. The most important thing to George Washington was a well-armed, well-trained, well-disciplined population. We, the people, are the first line of defense. And here's how he put it. Among the many interesting objects which will engage your attention, that of providing for the common defense will merit particular regard. To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. So this is a general, a very famous general, saying like, just to be prepared for what might come will allow us to achieve our goal. Our goal, though, is peace. A free people, he said, ought not only to be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies. He back to over here to Mount Vernon, back to George Washington's speech. They point out mountvernon.org. The president went on to outline what he saw as the republic's most important challenges. He argued pointedly that Congress should fund and support efforts to protect the interests of the United States in foreign affairs. He encouraged Congress to consider key domestic issues, including immigration, the establishment of a national currency, and a standard of weights and measures, and the establishment of a post office and a system of education. Now, this is a very common take. You'll find this type of view, especially because Mount Vernon is George Washington's estate, but it also has some, I would say, some misrepresentations, if I'm going to be generous here. Some of it I think is just false. First of all, he said nothing about immigration. The word immigration did not come up. Here's how he put it. Various considerations also render it expedient that the terms on which foreigners may be admitted to the rights of citizens should be speedily ascertained by a uniform rule of naturalization. And they did pass a Naturalization Act a while after this because he asked for it. And they're like, this is what we got to deal with. But he wasn't talking about immigration. He was talking about whether or not to naturalize as citizens foreigners who were already there. So that's an important point. Then he also said this: uniformity in the currency, weights, and measures of the United States is an object of great importance and will, I am persuaded, be duly attended to. Now, I could debate whether or not, maybe it's a semantics debate, whether or not George Washington was asking them to establish a national currency, but I'm not going to get too picky on that. But you might actually be interested in reading more about what happened after. On January 15th, just a week after this, Congress then requested Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson to draw up a plan for the uniformity of coins, weights, and measures of the United States. He submitted that to Congress in July of 1790. We did not get a Coinage Act until 1792. And then I would also disagree with the notion that Washington called for the establishment of a system of education. This is just false. He did not say we need to establish a national system of education under the control of Congress, and there's going to be a top-down control like what we have today in the Department of Education, because that's how it sounds. Now, those of us who've read his speech a number of times, and we know what really happened there, because this is just false. He did emphasize learning, education, knowledge, etc. He said knowledge in every country is the surest basis of public happiness. He said, to the security of a free constitution, it contributes in various ways. By convincing those who are entrusted with the public administration that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people, and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights. So the more that people are educated on the structure of the Constitution and the structure of and what their rights are, where they come from, our natural rights, for example, the better things are going to be under a constitution. And ignorant people will never be free, as Thomas Jefferson put it. He said to discern and provide against invasions of their rights, to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority, between burdens proceeding from a disregard to their convenience and those resulting from the inevitable exigencies of society. So knowledge was very, very important. Learning was very important. He called specifically for, quote, the promotion of science and literature. He did not say we need to establish a national or a congressional-run education system. Instead, I think he basically deferred to Congress to think about the best way to promote and advance a knowledgeable population, which I guess could include saying, we're going to do nothing. He's saying, this is what I think we should consider, but it's up to you. Here's how he put it. Whether this desirable object will be best promoted by affording aids to seminaries of learning already established, by the institution of a national university, or by other expedients, will be well worthy of a place in the deliberations of the legislature.
Well, let's move on to the main thing we wanted to talk about. We had to talk about the speech, but this is something that really got under your skin a couple of days ago, and you wanted to save it for Friday. Our colleague Chris is out, so everyone's stuck with me as the sidekick. Chris is much smarter than I am. But move on actually to the main. Yeah, there we go. So you saw this and were upset about it yesterday, rightly so. California moves to expand zero-down, interest-free loan program to illegal immigrants. California.
Back to subsidizing something, you get more of it, right?
Yeah.
And but I read through it, and the justification why you shouldn't worry about it is not a real cost. It's just a loan. If they sell the house, they have to pay back the loan. And I thought, well, maybe that'll be 10 years. Maybe how are you going to work? How are you going to do the math and the regulation? But the other big thing is they decided because when they sell the house, the government's going to get back its loan. I said, yeah, like they got the student loans back.
Yeah.
The ones that are conscientious about it paid it back, and then they had to pay for the people who didn't pay it off, and then they're not going to. You know?
Yeah, I remember back in 07 and 08 when the housing crisis happened, and I wasn't doing that, so I only heard it from the periphery. But I remember you and Paul Martin and them working on this so hard, and it just seems like we've learned nothing. They've learned nothing. The fallacy that your house will always increase in value automatically, and you can just pay it off. I mean, they haven't learned a thing since 08.
But then they visualize that if you give everybody a house and loan them the money, there'll have to be some money exchange, money out of one person's pocket to pay for the other, that it will circulate and increase the economy. So they think it's a real great stimulus. Well, you know, when there's an announcement on a few of these loans made, it might stimulate government housing, you know, for a week or two, but it's not a solution. It's mischief, and it's based on the principle of stealing from one person and giving it to another, because the people whose money this is are the people who do nothing suffer the consequences because they get taxed. They have to pay the inflation tax. So it's just horrible. But that's the last thing they think about in Congress, I thought, was have the pros and cons on a piece of legislation based on a moral basis. And they'll brag about the Constitution and other things, but most of the time, the most important thing, and I've said this before, the most important time is looking at the list who sponsors the bill, which lobbyist says this is a no yes vote, this is a no vote. That's the one that's the bottom line for a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just give a little bit of explanation of what the bill is. If you can put the next one on. It's Assembly Bill 1840 in the California State Assembly, and it would change existing law to allow illegal immigrants, maybe we should call them undocumented, to be eligible for the California Dream for All Fund, which provides interest-free loans for a down payment on first-time buyers. So basically, there's already a program that says, hey, want some money? Here's some money. Here's some free money. They just want to extend it. And here is the Democrat in the Assembly, Joaquin Arambula, and here's his rationale for introducing this bill. He wanted to ensure that qualified first-time homebuyers included undocumented applicants. So people that aren't allowed to be here, they can still have this. Okay,
I was just going to bring up another sentence from that article. It says the social and economic benefits of home ownership should be available to everyone. That's good. Freedom should be available to everyone. He said, arguing that it's wrong to exclude people from the benefits of the California Dream for All Fund program just because they're illegal immigrants and they want to get their house built with stolen money that the government is the participant in. And also, I wanted to add the illegal immigrants where the votes will come from.
Oh, yeah, you bet, yeah.
Well, but that's not polite to say that. Biden didn't mention that last night.
Here's some money and here's your voting registration. We filled out the form for you conveniently. But I did want to point out one thing, though, because we're not just picking on Democrats. Both sides don't get it. And this jumped out at me in the article, Dr. Paul. I'm sure you saw it, too, if you can put this next one on. This is so typical of the Republican response to stupid Democrat things. If you can put that next one up. Now, this is Brian Dahl. He's a Republican Assembly member in California. Here's what he said. Assembly Bill 1840 is an insult to California citizens who are being left behind and priced out of home ownership. I'm all for helping first-time home buyers, but give priority for those who are here in our state legally. In other words, he's saying, I'm all for stealing money to give it to people, but you should do it the Republican way.
As long as we can designate who we're bribing for the next vote. No, it's criminal, and that's why the non-aggression principle is so important, that if you can't do it on a personal level, you can't go and steal somebody's house or their cars or anything, but you can always send a member of Congress to vote a certain way, and all of a sudden, they're good people, they're moral people, they care about their neighbors. But of course, if you look at Venezuela and seen what happened there, and Zimbabwe, it doesn't work. But it's happening here. You know, the consequence, you can't divorce and excuse what we see in our big cities now with crime, because all that stuff is built on crime. This will stir up some resentment, but the government's involved in criminal activity. Well, the whole idea, we don't have the money, but no sweat, they're still taking it. We'll print the money, we're counterfeiters, and they don't care. So it's all built on illusion, and they don't even, I don't know, they must delude themselves, that nothing could happen. But there's no record on history where there's some of the fiat currency stuff has lasted a long time, but it eventually gets caught up, and it leads to suffering, and it usually ends up in war too.
The thing that gets me about this Republican response, and we're not picking on him because I'm sure if you surveyed all of them, they don't believe in the free market. The free market determines those who are eligible to buy a home. If you interfere with that market, you'll have people in a home that they can't afford, and then they'll lose the home and lose everything with it. Republicans, as this assemblyman, fundamentally don't believe in the free market. And what's ironic is people like him, and I'm not picking on him, but others like him, they would be the first to scream and rant about these socialist hellholes like Venezuela. But people like him are just every bit as socialist as the leaders of Venezuela. They don't believe fundamentally that markets make choices, and they will tell you what you can and can't do. I'd love to live in $1 million house. I can't afford it. The market's telling me I don't have enough money. And so it's terrible to see Republicans just as socialist as Democrats.
All this nonsense is going to come to an end, and bits and pieces every day we see it. So if they can take a monetary system that when they inherited or took it away from the private sources, so to speak, and gold is $20 an ounce, and now it's over $2,000 an ounce. People must wake up and say, well, how does that work? Who gets all these benefits? Well, the first group that gets the benefit is the government, because they get to spend it. And then the second people to get it are the financiers and the big corporations. And the last people to that get it are the people that, didn't get it. They got a pay raise, but it never even came close to the cost of living increases, and they get stuck with it. And they say, well, is those people gouging us? No, it's the politicians and the bureaucrats who believe in this system, and they believe that inflation, destruction of the currency, is a good way, to take care of the poor, which is a bunch of lies. And someday we have to expose them on that, and more people know today there's something wrong. So far, there's too many people blaming the wrong thing, and that's why I think economic education is so important, and why I highly recommend that people get engaged in studying Austrian free market economics. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
There be any psychological hedonists who were not ethical hedonists? Yes, I can't offhand think of the names, but in theory, I've met that type. And their reasoning is simply this. If man is necessitated to pursue pleasure and has no choice about the running of his life, morality is simply out of the picture. It's a waste of time. There's no use telling a piece of chalk once you throw it out the window. By the way, it's your moral obligation to fall. Because if the chalk could hear you, it would answer back, don't bother telling me, I'm going to do it anyway. And if man is necessitated to pursue pleasure, so this type argues, it's senseless to build any ethical theory, even a hedonistic kind, on its basis. And that, of course, is valid. But it presupposes, of course, that determinism is incompatible with morality. Please discuss the issue of life versus happiness versus pleasure as the standard of value in an ethics. Yes. First, let us take the issue of hedonism versus eudaimonism, life versus happiness. What's the difference? Well, in general, there's two main points. Hedone, or pleasure, is, as the Greek term was used, exclusively an emotional state, a state of feeling a certain kind of enjoyment or satisfaction. Whereas eudaimonia, as we saw last time, is a much broader concept, involving a total way of life, not only emotion, but thought, achievement, action. And secondly, hedone, pleasure, is a short-range, temporary feeling. You experience pleasure for a minute, or if you're lucky for an hour, but it doesn't go on in perpetuity. It's broken with intervals of indifference or pain, etc. And so the good life for the hedonist consists of having as big a number of discrete pleasurable experiences as you can, having a sum of, in effect, disconnected separate pleasures. In this sense, hedonism is a short-range mentality in ethics. It simply wants as much discrete units of enjoyment as it can get. Whereas eudaimonia is a much more philosophic approach. Happiness represents an enduring, long-range state of the total person, a character attribute, in effect, not an ephemeral feeling. And you see, we can talk about, for instance, a happy person, but you wouldn't talk about a pleased person as a character attribute. One is ephemeral, the other is enduring. So in these respects, these two respects, eudaimonism is, of course, much superior as an ethical standard to hedonism. Now, I should add, however, that very often today, the word happiness is used by hedonists as simply a long-range preponderance of pleasure over pain. That is, they interpret the concept hedonistically. And that being so, a hedonist will talk completely indifferently of pleasure or happiness, and so the distinction here collapses. This is simply a historical point of the relation between Aristotle and the eudaimonist, and the hedonist. Now, as to the objectivist view, objectivism opposes any theory which makes an emotion, whether long run or short run, a standard of value. Objectivism says, and for details I refer you to Ayn Rand's work on the objectivist ethics, the opening essay in The Virtue of Selfishness, because that discusses the issue explicitly. Objectivism holds that happiness, enjoyment of life, can properly be the ultimate purpose of ethics, but never the standard. Now, by an ethical standard, we mean that criterion, that measuring rod, by a reference to which we determine the value or virtue of any other candidate. Is this action right or wrong? By reference to this standard. Is this quality good or bad? By reference to this standard. Is this purpose desirable or undesirable? By reference to this standard. Now, if your ethics is to be objective, your standard must be a fact, not a feeling. It must be something that you can prove objectively, determines a necessary set of derivative values. Now, if the life of the organism is the standard, that is a fact, and it has definite objective requirements regardless of who feels what. And you have an objective ethics. But if happiness is the standard, well, then the first question is, what is happiness? It's an inner emotional state. And what kind of state? It's a state that comes from achieving your values. Well, that presupposes you have a code of values then. What was the standard of that code, and where did you get it from? Now, if an emotion is a response to values, then to make an emotion the standard is to make your response to values the standard of values. But a response to values presupposes a code of values. So you're going in a hopeless circle. And the result is that anybody who takes an emotion as the standard is philosophically parasitic. He is actually, in fact, regardless of his protestations, simply taking over, eclectically usually, the values generated by philosophers who do not hold emotions as the standard. He's accepting and absorbing them, reacting on the basis, and then using his subjective emotion as the standard. Now, Aristotle did not intend to be subjective. That's why he insisted that eudaimonia was not simply emotion. But, of course, it did include it, and it is a serious error. And in that one respect, Aristotle's ethics does incline toward subjectivism. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Ayn Rand chose life as the standard because she wanted an objective ethics and that was the only way to get one. That would be the primacy of consciousness. She proved that life is the standard. So